guys, JKMan99 here, and welcome to my Lost videos. Alright, this is season 5 of my alternate version of Lost, and just a couple things before we get started. First off, thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to all of these videos. If you've made it this far, you have watched a lot of my videos, and I really do appreciate your time diving into what is essentially my version of what I think the show should have done. Second, make sure that you have already watched the entire show of Lost before watching this, because at this point we're going to dive into a lot of different differences now. So the best thing you can do is just make sure you're completely caught up on everything Lost, so you know it like the back of your hand. So if I say anything that sounds confusing, you know actually what I'm talking about. So make sure you do that. If this is the first time you've seen any of these videos, I have links to my version of Lost seasons 1 through 4 in the description. Okay, so last we left off, the Oceanic 16 are off island, and we are about to go into the hijinks of whether or not they even get back to the island, and then we will also see what happens with those who got left behind on the island. And remember, this season, the main question we are answering, what if there was no Ajira plane at all? So in other words, they don't take a plane to get back to the island. There are no Ajira survivors, so that means no bodyguards of Jacob. However, there will be one Alana flashback in the finale, and we will explain what Alana's doing there in season 6. But that's the only connection with the Ajira Flight. So that also means, and I'm spoiling this right out of the gate here, that also means no Frank. Frank was the pilot of the Ajira Flight, so therefore, if there is no Ajira Flight, there is no Frank. So Frank will not be in the rest of the show. He's done. He is in this season in a flashback, but there's no more new Frank after this season. So there you go. So we will find out whether or not they make it back to the island, whether or not the show is going to be completely off island from now on. A whole bunch of hijinks could happen. So we'll see what's going to happen. Also, just to give you an idea of how different this season is, there are three original episodes in this season. Okay, so in other words, I have completely come up with 3 episodes that are not canon to the actual show at all. They're completely my ideas. There's nothing in them that are exactly what the show does. There are definitely things that are borrowed, like characters and other flashbacks. One, though, I'm pretty sure, like the first of the 3, I think is completely unique. I don't think I think there might be one scene in that one that is borrowed from the 5th episode, and that's in the 8th episode. You'll see when we get there. I expected this intro to be short, but it ended up being way longer than I expected. So without any further ado, here we go. Okay, so for season 5, our main characters are Kate, Sawyer, Hurley, Ben, Juliet, Daniel, Desmond, Locke, Sayid, Jin, Sun, Jack, and Richard. So yeah, we're including Richard as a main character starting even earlier than the show did. We're starting him as a main character in season 5. For reoccurring characters, we have Rose, Vincent, Nikki, Frogert, Bernard, and Walt. And for extras, we're just going to have Beth, Faith, and Marcia. So for episode 1 in season 5, we have Because You Left, which is actually not a centric episode, just like the finale of season 1 itself. This episode is the same except for the following differences. The episode has 3 settings: the Oceanic 16 in 2007, Locke on the island in 2004, and the rest of the survivors unstuck in time. So yes, we are doing time travel in season 5. There's no Miles or Charlotte, so therefore at the very beginning of the season we're not going to see a baby with Pierre Chang, because with no Miles there's no baby. So the episode's going to start with Daniel in the Dharma time with Pierre Chang, but then we're going to see the lost missing pieces scene of the chess game between Ben and Jack, and then after that we finally see Ben and Jack moving Locke in 2007. So with the lost survivors, in the years 2001 and 2007, it is only Sawyer, Juliet, Rose, Bernard, Daniel, Nikki, Frogert, and Vincent the dog on the island. Those were the folks that were all on the Zodiac raft, and in this season we reveal that the two other people were Nikki and Frogert. On the Zodiac, Bernard brings a rifle with him, and you can see him briefly carrying it in episode 1. Once they're on the shore, Sawyer and Juliet notice that the freighter is gone, and everyone else notices the camp is gone. So only Sawyer, Juliet, and Dan go to the hatch. When Dan asks if everybody's accounted for, Sawyer says that both Claire and Locke are not accounted for. So Claire's mentioned at this point. When they get to the hatch, it's still there because they did not blow it up in season 2, so it is still there in season 5. But it's that broken down version of the hatch where everything's flying around every 2 hours. And they still can see where the damage from where they blew up the others in season 3. Once they time travel to 2007, Dan asks Juliet what the purpose of the hatch was, and Juliet says it was no purpose. It was just an experiment left on for too long that Desmond unfortunately got stuck in for 3 years, pushing a button that served no purpose. So during this time period of 2007, they cut back to the beach where Bernard, Rose, Nikki, and Frogert are, and they notice that their stuff is all back. And then we see them going through their stuff, even though it had already been ransacked. So it's at this point in time we see that, whoa, what happened to all our stuff? Like, that happens here and not episode 4. So as they go around looking for supplies, Nikki goes back to her tent and she finds Paulo's backpack and puts it on. And as for the Oceanic 16 in 2007, the only difference here is that Hurley gets confused when Sayid starts talking about Bentham. Hurley says, wait, are we talking about the boat captain or Locke? And Sayid quickly says they're talking about Locke. So, as for Locke, he is in 2004. Locke stays in the present, and we see him try to become the leader of the others. Locke is in the present because he was not in the water. Only everyone in the water at the time the island moved time traveled. Okay? So that's why they time traveled, and that's why Locke did not. And that's why nobody else on the island did either. So let's just, before we move on, let's just quickly go over the main character locations. So 2004 on the island, we're going to have Locke and Richard. 2007 off island, we have Jack, Kate, Sayid's son, Hurley, Desmond, and Ben. And then somewhere in time on the island, we have Sawyer, Juliet, Dan, Jin, and Richard. Now, Richard is not time traveling, but he's going to appear in multiple timelines. Alright, so back to the story. Locke asks Richard why no one else seems too fazed about the sky turning purple, and Richard explains that from time to time the island moves, and this time it is no different. So that even confirms that at the end of season 2, when the sky turned purple, the island moved at that time. Since Ben said whoever moves the island can never come back, Locke knows that Ben has left the island. So Locke asks if that's true. If you move the island, you can't come back. And Richard says that yes, that's a rule, and Ben is banished from the island. This confuses Locke because Christian had told him to move the island, so Christian knew he would have to leave the island in order to save it. Richard says he does not know. Locke says he wants to talk to Christian, but Richard tells Locke that there is no Christian. Locke gets on top of a rock to address the rest of the group, and he says that he knows that they've all been through a lot with a freighter and everything, but many innocent people may have survived the attack, and he wants to send out some search and rescue parties and provide aid if needed. The others completely ignore this request and go back to what they were doing. Locke gets down from the rock and asks Richard why nobody is listening to him, and Richard says that he's not the leader yet. So episode 2 is The Lie, which is a Hurley episode, and this episode will primarily go back and forth between the survivors in 1954 and the Oceanic 16 in 2007, but there is a brief 2004 flashback. It is the boat before they go to shore. And by the boat, I mean the boat that rescues them. So in the rescue boat flashback, we have Jack trying to convince everyone to accept Jeremy Bentham's plan to lie. And we have Beth, Faith, Marcia, Desmond, Penny, Frank, Kate, Aaron, Sayid, and Hurley. Beth, Faith, and Marcia don't have any lines, so they're just sitting there and nodding, and everything else is basically the same. And that is Frank's also only appearance for the rest of the show. So off island in 2007, there's no Ana Lucia ghost scene, like that's just completely removed. We just see Hurley driving around. And Hurley also reveals to his mom how the Oceanic 16 got its name. They said that after the 6 were rescued, they found 10 other survivors when they were looking for gin. So back on island in 1954, after Juliet says the Zodiac was along for the ride, Nikki tells them that they can bring things with them. While at the hatch, they found Paulo's luggage, and now she has it. Even though they had just time traveled a couple times. So when Juliet suggested they could take the Zodiac, Dan also says it would be tough for all of them to get into the Zodiac because it was tough for them to go just 5 miles. A shipping lane was a whole other story, but he still needs to calculate a bearing. So later on that day, when Nikki is the one that brings Dan the fruit and not Charlotte because there's no Charlotte. And Nikki wants to know how soon it'll be before Dan can calculate a bearing, and Dan says he doesn't have an update, but he says that, but he again repeats that even if he did, taking everybody on the Zodiac will be difficult. So Nikki suggests that she and Daniel just take the Zodiac alone, and they can send back help once they're rescued, and there's no point in all of them leaving when it's dangerous. She tells him to think about it and then goes off to get more fruit for him. So Nikki's being very flirtatious with Daniel, very similar to how Ginger was always flirtatious with people who came to Gilligan's Island. The only difference here is that when Ginger was being flirtatious with people, she wanted everybody to be rescued, whereas Nikki is just concerned about herself. So Juliet, who was in charge of getting water, finds a big barrel of water that says Army on it, and she carries it back to the beach. And she asks if anybody has any bottles or cups on them, and Frogurt says, oh yeah, they're in the kitchen. And, Juliet's like, what's your problem? And that's when he has his major freak out, and he's like, we can't even get fire. And then the flaming arrows come, and Frogurt gets hit by the flaming arrows, dying at that point. And then, since, again, there's not many people there, so Sawyer, Juliet, Dan, Bernard, Rose, and Nikki, and Vincent the dog, they all run off and in separate directions. And, well, actually, most of them run off. Nikki stops. Nikki turns and faces where the arrows are coming from and exclaims that she will give them diamonds if they let her live and take everyone else. And Nikki dies right after this. She gets hit with a bunch of flaming arrows and she dies. So at the end of the episode, when they're about to chop off Juliet's hand, Locke doesn't come out of the woods or anything like that. It's actually Bernard. Remember, Locke's not time traveling. It's Bernard that saves Juliet and Sawyer with that rifle that he brought with him when they went to the freighter originally. So episode 3 is Jughead, which is a Richard episode. And yeah, it's a Richard episode because we're going to oscillate between 2 different time periods, and Richard's going to be in both time periods. It's going to switch between Locke being taught to be a leader and Sawyer and the rest of them in 1954. We're actually going to have one 2004 scene. In the 2004 to 2007 time period, because we don't know when this happened, we'll start with the birth of Desmond and Penny's son, Charlie, and then it's going to show little Charlie as like a 3-year-old or something, or 2-year-old maybe, sailing to Great Britain. Penny will say Britain is also where Daddy got arrested, and that's why he broke her heart. So then we go back, and that's it for Desmond. That's all we see of him. So on island in 1954, basically Bernard's taken Locke's place in this episode because Bernard and Rose got separated on the way to the creek. The only 2 people that make it to the creek are Dan and Rose. And when they get there, Rose yells out for Bernard, and that's when the others show up. Since Rose barely knows Dan or even trusts him at this point, she's quick to say that he's the one in charge. When they walk to Richard's camp, they never see any dead bodies or anything, primarily because Miles is not there. And when they get there, Richard asks Dan what his name is, and then Dan asks Richard what his name is, and that actually gets Rose smiling, so she's kind of loosening up on on Dan a little bit. But then it kind of turns into a comedy episode, because later on when Richard comes in and asks Dan like how they can trust him, Daniel lies and tells Richard that he's in love with Rose. So before Dan gets led away to the bomb, that's when Rose asks Dan, of all the hundreds of ways you could have convinced him you weren't going to blow up the island, you went with that? And it, Dan and Rose are different ages, and not only that, but Rose has a wedding ring, Dan doesn't. I mean, it's kind of obvious that it was a lie. Back with Bernard and Sawyer and Juliet, when young Whitmore runs away, Bernard refuses to shoot him, just like Locke did in the actual show. And Bernard tells Sawyer that it's not as easy for him to just shoot people. Like, he was unarmed. He just wasn't going to shoot the guy. Before, when Juliet was about to get her arm chopped off, it was a different story. In the army, it was, they were at war, like, different circumstances. So when they follow Whitmore to the camp, they see Rose being led to another tent, and Bernard insists on trying to save her. Sawyer advises against it because he knows he's just either going to get killed or captured, and Bernard says he's either going to save her or be with her. And like Sawyer said, when Bernard goes down to try to save her, he is quickly captured, but he's brought to Rose's tent. And that kind of creates a funny scene because, Richard says to Rose, like, you better tell him about your boyfriend, and because they say that they're married, and then like Bernard's like, well, what's going on, and the boyfriend is Dan apparently, so hijinks ensue. All right, so back on island, 2004, Locke is given that same 3-choice test seen in Cabin Fever, and Locke gets the answer right this time, which is celebrated by the others. Richard tells John that tomorrow he will take him to the temple, and the rest of the tests will begin. Richard asks John his plans for the island, and Locke says that at this point he needs all the answers he can before he can make any plans. Richard says the others have been the protectors of the island for years, with the guidance of Jacob, and both Jacob and the leader can leave the island at will for necessary survival purposes. He once again explains that Christian was there in the cabin and not Jacob. Locke says he knows how to leave the island because he saw Ben leave when he was banished, but he also asks how to leave the island and come back at will, and Richard says that is still very privileged information that only a few people know. Richard tells Locke not to tell anybody else about what's in the Orchid Station because it's unsafe for the others to know. So then we see Locke at the temple being put into the water. This is the first time we're going to meet Dogen. It's also the first time we see the temple. It happens in season 5. And Dogen cuts Locke with the knife and says that every leader has been healed by these waters instantly, and if Locke isn't healed, he can't be the leader. Well, his back's broken, so everybody thinks, this should be a piece of cake. So naturally, he's put in the water, and the knife wound remains. Everybody walks away extremely disappointed, and Locke is left behind, and he's extremely crushed, and he begins to cry. So after that, Richard goes up to John nervously, and Richard says that he didn't understand. Richard said that it appeared that Locke was just too old. And John says he wished he could have been recruited younger. He tells Richard his birthday and suggests that if they had come to visit him when he was younger, he would have been a great leader. He told him Jacob sent him to recruit potential new leaders off the island before, but that he had never met anybody off island who could pass the first few tests in a long time. Richard then realizes that since no one had ever failed the test so badly on the island and Ben was just banished, that Locke just can't become one of the others. He would also have to follow suit and be banished as well. So on the island, 1954, after Eloise asks if they're from the future, they time travel again, and then the 5 of them unite, and because none of the tents are there anymore, obviously, but this time they notice that Juliet has a nosebleed. Now, she's not like having like a hemorrhage or anything like that. She just has like a small nosebleed. And they're like, whoa, what's going on? And Danielle says that Brandon, who was on the freighter, had a nosebleed after hitting the border of the island. And they asked, well, what happened to Brandon after he had the nosebleed? And Danielle reveals that Brandon died. And that's the end of episode 3. So episode 4 is The Little Prince, which is the Kate episode. The episode will go back and forth with Off Island 2007 and On Island 2004, 2007, and 1988. At the beginning of the episode, we have another flashback to the freighter that rescues them, where Jeremy Bentham is the captain, and this time we see Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham tells Jack that he's not sure everyone is going along with the lie plan, so he needs to convince the ones that are not. Jack says they won't go for it if it's just him, so he tells Kate that he's going to turn to her first, and, you know, Kate says she's always had his back, and we have that same scene from the actual show. So then we go on island, 2004. Now, not like 2004 present, but 2004 past. Like, remember, in that episode, they time travel to the day where Boone died. So, the key difference in episode 4 is the time travelers are Sawyer, Juliet, Dan, Bernard, and Rose. Bernard and Rose were in the other tent the whole time. Locke is not in the group, and no one has any nosebleeds outside of Juliet. So there's not like some major panic about what's going on, but there's a little bit of panic. They're like, okay, like, we need the time traveling to stop. So Dan, Juliet, and Sawyer brainstorm as to how this all could have started in the first place. Sawyer reveals that Ben, Hurley, and Locke went to some cabin and then to a greenhouse. Dan asks Sawyer if he knows how to get to the cabin, and Sawyer says no, he's never been there. Juliet also says the same. But then Dan asks about the orchid, and Sawyer says he knows how to get there, but just saw Ben and Locke go underground. He never saw what they did. So Juliet suggests that they need to go back to the orchid and see if they can stop whatever was started. So in 2007, when they get back to the beach, the outriggers are there just like they are on the actual show. The Zodiac's gone. That's all the same. And that's going to be it for episode 4. Like, everything else off island is exactly the same, and everything else on the show is the same. So that's it. That's the only differences in episode 4. Oh, one other thing. There is no Ajira water bottle in the outriggers. Remember, there's no Ajira plane in my version, so therefore there's no Ajira water bottle. Alright, so episode 5 is This Place's Death, which is a Desmond episode. There will be 3 parts to this episode: Jin in 1988, Sun in 2007, and Desmond also in 2007. The Sun and Jin scenes will go back and forth and will make up about 40% of the episode, and the rest of it will be the Desmond stuff. So in 1988, when Jin's asked about the radio tower, he says no, he does not know how to get there. As opposed to the actual show where he says yes, he's never been to the radio tower, so he should have no idea how to get there. Okay, now here comes the part that I almost missed, and I just noticed this at the last second, so there's going to be a tiny note here that's kind of important. So in this episode, Jin loses his wedding ring when Danielle is shooting at him, and because it just kind of comes off his hand somehow, and because he's running for his life, he couldn't exactly go back and get the ring. Then he time travels. Now, you already know that the Zodiac, like everything they had on them, time travels with them. But that only, in my version, okay? In my version, that's only going to apply to bigger objects like the Zodiac boat or clothes or things like that, like actual clothes around the body, stuff like that. But it's not going to apply to smaller objects like rings or like Juliet's rum bottle that she had on the actual show. I'm talking about the actual show now when she was on the beach. Like in the actual show, she has the rum, but at the beginning of season 5, the rum bottle isn't there. So like that did not time travel with them. Now you could, I mean, I know there's an argument that could be made there that, oh, she didn't have the rum bottle on her, maybe like when they time traveled. I get it, she wasn't holding it. But what I'm trying to say is, that's my explanation as to why the Zodiac time travels, but the ring does not time travel. Because in my version, Jin's ring is going to remain there in 1988. Okay? Because right after he runs for his life and his ring falls off, Jin time travels again, and a gun gets put on him, but as just like in the actual episode, it turns out to be Sawyer. But we don't know what time period he's in yet. We have to wait a few episodes to find out where they are. And in 2007, when Ben gives Sun the ring, Ben says that he got the ring from a woman in the church that they're at. He never says John gave it to him. So therefore, Jack never asks about it. So basically what this all is remember, Locke does not time travel. So if Locke's not time traveling, Jin can't give Locke the ring. So that's what happens. It falls off. Not the greatest thing I've ever come up with, but it's something. So after that, when Desmond comes up to them and says, "What are you doing here?" that's when we get Desmond's entire flashback to London, which is revealed to be 1 month prior to that period of time in 2007. Then we'll see how Desmond gets back to LA, and that flashback is basically the same, except Daniel's lab assistant doesn't mentally time travel or think she's 5 or anything like that. She's just suffering from radiation poisoning, and basically everything is the same for other than that, for Desmond's flashback to being in London. And that would be the end of my changes for episode 5. So episode 6 is the life and death of Jeremy Bentham, which is a Locke-centric episode. There's no flashbacks. It only follows Locke's story from the Orchid to his murder. So on Island 2004, when Locke is banished, he's taken to the Orchid and he goes down to the same tunnel Ben went down. Richard shakes Locke's hand and says, "Goodbye, John. I wish things could have been different." When he gets down there, Christian is already waiting for him. Christian explains that because Locke didn't move the island and Ben did, people left the island that shouldn't have. Then Christian gives Locke a list of names, and those names are Jack, Sayid, Kate, and Hurley. And Christian says that Locke needs to bring all of them back, and if he does, that will end his banishment. So it is implied that if Locke had moved the island and not Ben, the helicopter may have time traveled as well. It might have been inside the radius, things like that. So there's no talk about Locke dying. There's no talk about Locke needing to make a sacrifice or anything like that. He just needs to end the banishment. So off Island 2007, when Locke wakes up in Tunisia, the knife stabbed into him during his teleportation, so that's why he's having the problems. He doesn't fall or anything like he does in the actual show. It's just he had some teleportation problems and the knife appeared in his leg. Widmore never meets Locke on the island, so that he never mentions that or any time travel thing, except the only thing of time travel reference is when he mentions that Locke is 3 years in the future from his time period. Locke also never says he chose to leave or anything like that. Widmore incorrectly believes that the island did not want the entire Oceanic 16 to leave. So he had files on all 16 members of the Oceanic 16 and also Walt. Locke knows he just needs 4, but he doesn't tell Widmore that. And when he's going through the files, he notes where Walt is. Like, he's like, "Ooh, Walt's in New York City, that's interesting." But he just sort of keeps that to himself. So, at first Locke denies that he's there to get anybody back, but like on the show, he admits it. But he's not specific about who he's there to get back. Widmore wants to help not due to a war or anything, but because he is also exiled as well. So then Locke is introduced to Widmore's driver. And Widmore's driver is going to be Captain Jeremy Bentham. Widmore uses the name of the driver's name as Locke's alias just in case either of them are captured or questioned. So of course Locke is like, "Well, what happens if we both need to show ID? Isn't that going to get a little confusing?" And Bentham pats the gun he has on him and says, "You don't have to worry about that." So a couple things here. Matthew Amadon is replaced by Captain Jeremy Bentham. The other thing is, this isn't really the greatest plan that they've came up with for this alias, but we'll just give you the name of somebody else that's with you. But it's also possible for 2 people to have the same name, so I don't know. Maybe it's not that far fetched. We'll see. And I'm pretty sure that it was a Canadian passport, so it could be 2 different countries, same name. Sayid recognizes Bentham from the boat, so that's how he knows that Bentham is moving Locke around. And Sayid incorrectly assumes that Penny and Desmond made the arrangement with Bentham to move Locke around the world, basically. So Sayid just accepts it. He never questions it. So when he goes to Sayid and Kate and Jack and tells them, like, "We got to save everybody," he's lying. He just needs them to come back because his banishment will end. So it's very selfish of him. He doesn't even know what happened to Sawyer and the rest of them. He has no idea if they're okay or not. So all that is just a lie. But Locke still goes to see Walt in New York City. And the reason he does this is for 2 things. One, he legitimately wants to see if he's doing okay. The other thing that Locke wants is to ask Walt if he has any further instructions for him. Now, what Locke is getting at is 3 years prior, while on the island, Walt told him to stop a woman named Ruth from contacting her boat. So when Locke says this, Walt is very confused, and he says he never spoke or even dreamed about Locke after leaving the island. So Locke just says, well, I must have just heard somebody else that sounded like you. And Walt accepts this, and he says, oh, okay. And, it's a very positive conversation. Just like on the actual show, Locke doesn't tell Walt that Michael's dead. He just says, last I heard, Michael was on a boat near the island. So, very nice, positive conversation overall. And Walt never mentions dreaming about John in a suit, so that's also important as well. Alright, so the Hurley and Locke conversation is different when Hurley sees Bentham. Hurley is like, that's Penny's boat captain, and asked if Locke was with Penny and Desmond. And Locke says, no, I'm actually with Charles Widmore. And Hurley starts freaking out and reminds Locke that Widmore is evil and goes back inside. So Locke suggests to Bentham that he may do a better job convincing them than he's doing. But Bentham points out that if he helps out at all, other than the driving, Widmore will know and will kill him. Widmore will figure out that he helped them on Penny's boat to begin with. So Locke suggests that the whole lying thing may actually have nothing to do with the island, but Bentham himself just trying to save himself. So Bentham doesn't offer to find anybody for Locke, and he wants to stay under radar. In fact, Bentham is very nervous throughout the entire ordeal. Bentham does, however, take him to Helen's grave when requested. Bentham reluctantly does this, but he never claims to be somebody who can find people. When Locke asks what he does for Widmore, he says that he protects what Widmore loves the most, and apparently Widmore loves you the most right now, John. So, Jeremy Bentham was never Locke's orderly, so there's no reference about the walkabout or anything like that. When Bentham is killed by Ben, Locke sees Ben do it. That's how Locke tells Jack that Ben is off island at the hospital. At the hospital, Locke told Jack the bad things happened after he left, and it was Jack's fault because he left. He doesn't know what happened to Sawyer and the others, or that they're even time traveling again. Locke's lying. He just wants Jack to go back to the island. There's never any conversation between Locke and Ben about Locke promising Jin not to bring Sun back. Remember, Jin and Locke never see each other because Locke's not time traveling, so that never actually happens. So there's no talk about Locke needing to die or anything like that. So it was unfortunately Locke's choice to try to commit suicide when he was off of the island. No one told him to. He didn't do it because he thought it would bring everybody back. He just got really depressed and unfortunately tried to commit suicide. Ben only used the submarine to get back to the island, and therefore he needed to know who could tell him how to get back. Ben believed that if Widmore was helping Locke, then he must have some way back to the island, because otherwise he wouldn't be trying to bring everyone back. See, Locke needed to know how to get back. So both Ben and Widmore were both using Locke to try to end their own banishment. And just like Locke was trying to use the others to end his banishment. And that's why Ben saved Locke to get Eloise Hawking's name, and then he just went back to killing him. And he killed him because, John was a threat to his leadership. Or his power, I should say. So episode 7 is 316, which is a Jack-centric episode. Before the discussion of the island always moving, Sun asks Miss Hawking how Ben had Jin's ring, and she said that Ben gave it to her many years ago in her jewelry shop, and Desmond acknowledged the jewelry shop was real. So Eloise says, alright, I apologize if this is confusing, but the room we're standing in was constructed years ago over a unique pocket of electromagnetic energy. This pocket connects to similar pockets all over the world. The one who built this room, however, was only interested in one, the island. They gathered proof that it existed. They knew it was out there somewhere, but they just couldn't find it. Then a man named Horace Goodspeed built this pendulum on the theoretical notion that they should stop looking for where the island was supposed to be and start looking for where it was going to be. Jack asks, what do you mean? Eloise says, the island is always moving. Why do you think you were never rescued? Now, while the movements of the island seem random, Horace and his team of scientists created a series of equations which tell us where the island is going to be at a certain point in time. Windows that provide a way back. Unfortunately, these windows won't stay open for very long. Yours closes in 36 hours at approximately 3:16 p.m. If you want to go back to the island, then you need to be at the church in 36 hours, no later than 3:16 p.m. So Jack asks what happens at 3:16, and Eloise says that she can't tell them. They just need to be there and you'll find out then. So, then Desmond chimes in with how crazy everything is, but Desmond never says that Eloise said he had to go to the island. He just refers to the 4 years of his life was the time that he spent in prison because of her. Now, this part's really important. Remember, in the actual show, the Ajira Flight was Ajira 3:16, and that takes him back to the island. That is negated from my version. There is no Ajira Flight. There is no planes, okay? There's no talk about any flights or airports. All of that is negated. So Eloise still says they need to recreate the flight scenario, though, as best as they can for this to work. And that means, getting as many people as they can back. Otherwise, the results can be unpredictable. So Jack asks if they need to try to find Walt and Steve and the rest of them, but Eloise says no, there's not enough time for that. But what would actually really help is if they take Locke's body back and Jack gives Locke something that belonged to his father, since Christian was originally on the flight. And then the rest of the episode where Jack kind of gets upset about that happens, but he still agrees to it. We'll get there. So Jack asks Ben in the church if he killed Locke, because remember, Eloise says that John committed suicide, but Jack's starting to believe that Ben actually killed Locke, but Ben says no. Ben only killed Jeremy Bentham. And the reason he killed Bentham was because he thought that Bentham was going to kill Locke, but unfortunately Locke just killed himself. So after leaving the church, Jack still goes to the bar. Then he visits his grandfather Ray and gets his dad's shoes per Eloise's instructions. Then he goes home and hooks up with Kate, and then he picks up Locke's body. So all that's the same. Now, Jack does not give Locke the suicide note back in the coffin. He still holds on to the note and doesn't read it. Jack arrives at the church, first expecting Kate to be there, but the first one he sees is Son. Son says if there's even a chance of Jen being alive, she had to see this through. Shortly thereafter, Sayid comes into the church. Now remember, at the church before, the only people that were there were Jack, Son, Ben, and Desmond. So seeing Sayid is out of nowhere is kind of nuts. And remember, Kate also knows to go to the church. So those are the only ones that anyone's expecting. So seeing Sayid is really, really surprising. So Sayid comes into the church, avoids any contact with them, and sits by himself, very guarded. And, he kind of has stay away written all over him, so Jack and Son don't approach him. Then Kate comes in, and then Jack goes up to her and says, "Hey, you made it." And Kate agreed, but she's not really happy about it. And she does not look at Son, because remember, she's not really happy with Son because Son brought Aaron to the dock when Son was trying to kill Ben. Then Miss Hawking shows up and is about to take him to a room, but then Hurley walks in. And then, Jack asked Hurley, how he knew where they was, how is he out of jail? And Hurley's just like, "Hey, I'm here, right? Let's do this." So Miss Hawking leads all 5 of them to a room located far beneath the church. And then Eloise says, "Just like the island pulled the plane when it was in the electromagnetic window, you will be pulled as well. At 3:16 p.m., this room will turn all white and will pull you to the island. Oh, let's go get John's body and bring it in here. And you will need to remove anything metal on you." So Jack, Sayid, Hurley, Kate, and Miss Hawking all go out to the truck that has the coffin in it and bring in the wooden coffin, and they walk it down to the room with them. And at 3:10, Miss Hawking says good luck and goes to leave the room. Hurley asks if she's coming too, and she says, "No, dear, my work is here help others along. While they're waiting for the 6 minutes to go by, Jack goes up to Kate and says how amazing it is that both Hurley and Sayid showed up, and Kate doesn't acknowledge this is anything special. She's like, just because we're in the same room, it doesn't mean we're all together or that this means anything. So just then, Ben runs into the room, and Sayid looks upset as if he wasn't expecting Ben to be there. Hurley does too, and is like, whoa, 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 he can't come. And Jack says that this is the way it has to be. Just then, the room begins to light up. Everyone gets a little nervous and spreads out in their own way. Ben and Son in the coffin are on the one side of the room, while Jack, Kate, Sayid, and Hurley in the guitar case are on the other side of the room. The white light goes up and then back down, and when it goes back down, Jack, Kate, Hurley, and Sayid are all in a desert and all take turns throwing up. Hurley asks Jack if he knew about that part and know that they were all going to get sick. And Jack says no, he did not know that. Kate asks where Son is, where the coffin is, where Ben is, and Hurley wonders what part of the island they're on. And Sayid finally says his first lines of the episode, his first and only lines of the episode. He says, "We're not on the island." They notice that Sayid's looking up at something, so they all turn and look at what Sayid's looking at, and they look up and see in the distance the Egyptian pyramids. And that's the end of the episode. So episode 8 is Walk Like an Egyptian, and just like the first episode of the season, there's no central character here. It's a brand new episode which will go back and forth between 3087 BC on the island and off island in the country of Egypt. So on the island, Sawyer and Juliet explained to Jin that they are moving through time. Jin looks concerned and speaks Korean back. They're basically having a communication breakdown. So Bernard shakes his head and says that they're going to just be there all day trying to figure this out. And then a bunch of Egyptians come out of the jungle. They pay special attention to Rose for some reason, and Bernard tries to fight them off, and then Rose and Bernard are dragged off one way, and Jin, Sawyer, Juliet, and Daniel are taken away in another direction, so the group's separated. Then we see the Lost logo, and then we go back to Egypt, where Jack, Kate, Hurley, and Sayid are in the desert. They have no idea what to do because they didn't bring cell phones or anything metal with them to the room, so Jack instinctively looks for a phone, but he finds Locke's suicide letter. So at that point, he finally reads it. And, he takes it in because it said, like, Jack, I wish you had believed me. But then he noticed that on the back of the suicide note, Miss Hawking wrote some notes for him. And it said if anything goes wrong, to contact Abraham if they are ever in Egypt. So Hurley points out, how are they going to find this guy? And Jack points out that they probably know that something went wrong and maybe she's going to call Abraham. But they debate why they can't just call her, and then Jack points out that the note also says that they can't contact her. So they decide if they are looking for someone, the best place to go is to the nearest landmark so they can get their bearings. So they walk towards the pyramids. So back on the island, 1 month later, we see Jin, Juliet, and Daniel working on the temple wall, while Sawyer is getting some sort of medical attention on his foot. You hear a chopping sound. Oh, before we go into that, remember, Sawyer has had some issues with his feet. He stepped on a dart in Season 3, and then in Season 5, Episode 2, he steps on a stick that goes through his toe. So his toe's been not doing so good. So you hear a chopping sound. It's off screen, and Sawyer yells out in pain off screen. You don't know what happened. So then some ancient Egyptians come to tell some other ancient Egyptians that, and this is all in subtitles, that their defenses are down. And based on the hand gestures, Daniel figures that the electromagnetic border may be having an issue. So Daniel tries to communicate that he can help. Daniel is taken away from the group, and up on top of a hill, Daniel can see a bunch of boats headed to the island. It turns out the boats are full of Elamites, and one of the boats seen is the Zodiac raft. So Dan yells back to the group that he found the Zodiac, And so basically what happened is that at some point the Zodiac was taken by the others during the 50s, and then it was in the water somewhere, and then the Zodiac time traveled. So that's how it ended up in 3087 BC. So back in Egypt, they reach the pyramids, and there's a tour guide with the name Abraham on it. Hurley says, no, it can't be that easy, can it? But Jack says, what could it hurt? So Jack says that they were sent by Miss Hawking, and in surprise, he says, oh my, you're the Oceanic 16, hello. And once confirmed that they're the Abraham that they were looking for, they all huddle up outside the pyramid. And when Jack says they're trying to get back to the island, Abraham starts to talk about the pockets in the windows. Abraham explains that the electromagnetic pockets around the world are all connected. So when you go near the energy, you are transported to an area close to one of the other electromagnetic pockets. So he sort of compares it to like an underground subway, but even though that's not really a great comparison. Jack asks what their window is from there, or do they have to go back to LA, or what's the situation? He's like, no, you can't go back to LA. He says that underneath the pyramid, there is another pocket in a secret pharaoh tomb hidden way underneath the pyramid. And he says it's due to light up at 4:20 p.m. in 4 days, but it probably won't take them back to the island. And they're a little surprised. They're like, well, how come we haven't heard about this before? And he's like, no, it's hidden. It's like way down, like nobody knows about it except me and like a few others. Abraham explained that after death, what used to happen in ancient Egypt was Egyptian royalty was sent to the island through that room, where it was thought that they would be brought back to life. So this is the first time that Jack really starts to believe that his father may still be alive. Now remember, that's the whole reason he's there. Like, Locke told him that his father said hello and it was Christian. So there was even that slight hint that his father might be alive. But, Jack still never really believed it. But he was still like, I have to see this through. I can't let go of this. But this is the first time Jack's really starting to believe that, wait a minute, maybe he actually is alive. So they decide that they should try to go back to LA or try the Egyptian room. And, they basically say that we'll stay here. Daniel is taken to the heart of the island and taken down into the tunnel. So this is the first time we're seeing the heart of the island in the middle of season 5, not the end of the series. 2 people try to put a cork back into the hole, which has no cork in it, but they are quickly turned to bones. So then they ask Daniel to do it, and Daniel's like, no, those guys just died, I don't want to do it. He asks for some rope, and he says they can try to reverse lasso the cork onto the plug. But once he makes that suggestion, all of a sudden he hears the sound of a smoke monster. And they all run out of the heart of the island. And now, what's really important here is that Dan does not replace the cork at this time. So all this smoke monster stuff is happening when there's no cork on the plug. So as the monster approaches Daniel, another flash of light appears, and there is a mummy tomb right in front of him, and a mummy comes out of the tomb. And the smoke monster goes up to the mummy, flashes the mummy, but then goes away and leaves the mummy alone. So Daniel's standing face to face with a mummy, so Daniel just naturally starts taking the bandages off the mummy, and it turns out that the mummy was Richard. So we can confirm that Richard came from ancient Egypt. So back to Egypt in modern times, they decide to go to the room despite the odds. Abraham explains that there are only a finite number of pockets, and eventually they will get back to the island. But the island is the hardest because it moves, so that's why the windows are hard to come by. But most of the other pockets flash at somewhat timely intervals, meaning that they don't have to wait months or years, but probably just days. But they may have to end up going in circles, and the island may take months or possibly years to get to if they can't calculate a new window. So Abraham tells them that they will send Sun as well if they find Sun, because they're thinking that Sun might be in Egypt somewhere. So they're like, if we see Sun, we'll send her along too. And they don't really care what happened to Ben or the coffin. So the Losties go into the room, and it lights up, and When the light goes down, it turns out they are in front of the Roman Colosseum. So Hurley says, well, that didn't work. So 2 months later on the island, Sawyer is seen with the Egyptians fighting the Elamites. Sawyer takes on a bunch of them at once, and when they have defeated all of them, the ancient Egyptians go up to Sawyer and praise him, saying that they will honor him. He can't understand a thing they're saying. So Sawyer is just like, yeah, that sounds great. So he rests next to Juliet after the big battle, and they kind of flirt a little bit, and boom, they time travel. They suddenly time travel out of there. And they're in a different time period. All the Egyptians are gone, but they see an Egyptian statue in the background. But unlike it just being the four-toed statue and all you see is the foot, this time the whole statue is there. And as they look up, they see that it is a statue of Sawyer. And that's the end of the episode. So yeah, before we move on though, yes, the Egyptians built a statue of Sawyer. So in my version, the four-toed statue is a giant statue of Sawyer. Alright, episode 9 is When in Rome, which is a Sayid episode. This episode takes place between 23 AD and off-island in Rome. Approximately, well, we don't know what the time period is, and I'll explain in a second. The time period is going to be an Easter egg in my version, because I'm even including Easter eggs in my version. So here's my Easter egg. During the Rome episode, they're going to pass a newspaper written in Italian that says the Steelers won Super Bowl 40. Now, Super Bowl 40 takes place in 2006. So we're basically secretly letting the audience know that in 2000 and that when they're going through all these portals, that they're probably time traveling as well. They're not just going to Egypt. They're not just going to Rome. They're going to Egypt and Rome in different time periods. But because it's so modern, they don't even realize they're not in 2007 anymore. Like in Egypt, it was never revealed what the time period was. But in Rome, it's revealed that it's 2006. So that's kind of important, because then that means that like all their interactions that they're having in 2006 in Rome, from a timeline perspective, were before their interactions they have in LA. So I hope that makes sense. So Jack, Kate, Hurley, and Sayid are outside of the Roman Colosseum. Jack refers to the suicide note and says that if they're ever in Rome, they need to speak to a man named Peter. Kate jokes and says they should all have a copy of this note just in case he loses it. They go to the Colosseum, and again, Peter works there. They bring up Miss Hawking, and Peter says that they actually have to go to the Vatican first, but they need to be careful because of Whitmore. And now that gets Sayid's attention, because he's like, wait a minute, I killed most of the organization. There shouldn't be any more threats. But Peter tells Sayid that he got almost all of the threats, but not all of them. And at this point, Sayid was trying to protect Hurley from Whitmore, but kind of suspected all along it was Ben. So since Ben wasn't there, but he was accounted for, he was surprised that Whitmore was still a real threat. So on island, they were amazed to see a Sawyer statue, but their amazement was kind of dampened because they are quickly captured by Romans. And the Romans noticed the resemblance between Sawyer and the statue pretty quickly, but they kind of brush it off at first. They assumed that he was just dressing up like the statue on purpose. Now there's a language gap again, but this time Juliet speaks Latin, so they're able to communicate with the Romans. So Sawyer suggests that they ask if they know Richard, and they said no. And they're taken to the Roman camp and introduced to a man named Esau. Esau takes them down into a cave where the wheel has not been installed yet, and says that all the Romans want to do is leave the island, and asks if they know how to help. They all say they can't help, but they also question why they would know, and Esau says that he believes that Sawyer is an important person because there's a statue for him, and he recognizes him. But Daniel actually speaks up at this point. He's like, you know what, I think there may be a way to help you. So off-island, we have Jack, Kate, Hurley, and Sayid. They make their way to the Vatican. Peter explains that all they have to do is go underground to a room that's not open to the public. And Peter explains that Rome has the most regular intervals of nearly every 24 hours at 6 p.m., give or take a minute. So while they look at the Vatican artwork, a woman comes up to Sayid and asks why they are at the Vatican, and he says he won a trip. She introduces herself as Naomi. So Naomi actually makes an appearance in my version, and asks if she wants to go get a drink outside of the Vatican walls at a wine bar, and he agrees. So on the island, 2 months pass, and Daniel and the Romans have found a way to safely remove the cork from the heart of the island. So remember, there was no cork on the plug when he left, but then there was a cork on the plug when he got there. But that doesn't mean anything, because thousands of years have passed between the ancient Egyptians and the Romans. So at some point in those thousands of years, somebody found a way to put a cork onto the plug. So that's fine. You know what I mean? At some point, they made some changes down there. So Daniel explains to Esau that the energy is powered in this part of the island, and they can only make the wheel work if the power is off. And removing the cork turns off the light. And once he makes the wheel, they can turn the power back on and see where they go. So Daniel asks Esau why he believes the wheel will take him off the island, and Esau says he just has faith that their group isn't supposed to be there. And they have seen other people on the island appear on the island while seeing a similar light that's in the cave. So Daniel explains to Sawyer, Juliet, and Jin that earlier in time the island used to be a lot more powerful. But after a while, the battery life of the island wore off, and it just needed to be plugged in. Daniel says, think of the island like a laptop. When you have a fully charged laptop, you can do things for several hours, but then when it becomes low on power, you have to plug the laptop back in. So thousands of years ago, and maybe even thousands of years, the island ran on battery power. But now, it's aged and needs to be plugged in. So putting the cork on the plug, it's how you're able to power the island. So now they're at a point in time where without the plug, there's no battery life and there's no power, and the electromagnetic energy is not there. So off island, Sayid and Naomi get to know each other at the bar. They even kiss. And Sayid says he hasn't kissed anybody since his wife, but Naomi takes offense to this and says, "What about Elsa?" Sayid's eyes widen, and it is revealed that she has the other half of the bracelet that Elsa had. So this reveals that Elsa and Naomi are either friends or something else, or sisters. We don't know. But the point is that like Naomi is hurt that Elsa was killed by Sayid, and she is there for revenge. Naomi reveals to Sayid that Widmore killed Nadia because he told her what really happened on the island. So he was truly the one that got her killed. So Naomi tries to kill Sayid in the empty bar, but Sayid kills Naomi first. Sayid exits the bar and goes back to the main chapel of the Vatican. Peter comes up to Sayid, and Sayid says what happens, and Peter sounds completely unsurprised. Peter takes them to the room underneath the Vatican and wishes them good luck, and says that there should only be a few more of these before getting back to the island. After he leaves, Kate says, if Hawking was talking about windows that don't stay open for very long, how is it only a few away? And then the room lit up and they disappeared again. So back on the island, it is 4 months later. The wheel has been built and the cork has now been reattached. Esau decides to be the first one to try to turn the wheel. Now, unlike Locke and Ben, Esau turns the wheel to the right. The chamber lit up and Esau disappears, presumably off the island. Several other Romans start to use the chamber to leave, and Juliet is kind of sitting off by herself. Now, before we go on, they turn it to the right, so the island doesn't move when they turn the wheel to the right. The island only moves when they turn it to the left, so that's kind of what we're saying here. So Sawyer comes up to Juliet and says, well, it looks like we have a hut all to ourselves now. Juliet looks troubled and says she's been here for over 4 years, and for the first time she has a chance to leave. And Sawyer points out that A, they don't know if they're actually leaving or just being destroyed in there, and B, it's probably thousands of years in the past. But before they can discuss it any further, they notice a group of people in one of the huts not leaving. And they look harder at that group of people and notice that one of them is Richard. Wondering why the Romans lied to them, Juliet calls out, "Richard," but he didn't respond. However, they hear the very familiar sound of the smoke monster and everybody just starts to scatter. Daniel's actually almost about to get caught by the smoke monster, but the sky lights up again and the four of them are taken away to another time. But we remain in 23 AD a little bit longer. We stay behind to see Richard rejoin the settlement after, everybody ran away from the smoke monster, and he says the name Ricardos out loud to himself. So this is the idea that Juliet gave Richard his name, and that the Romans weren't lying before when they said they didn't know who Richard was, because Richard had not named himself. He was probably going by an unknown Egyptian name at that time, and that's how Richard got his name. And then we see the Lost logo. Okay, so episode 10 is called Blackrock, which is a smoke monster centric episode. So this episode starts in the year 1867 AD with the scenes where the Blackrock is coming towards the island. Sawyer, Juliet, Jin, and Daniel arrive by time travel, and they immediately hear a large crash as the Blackrock crashes into the four-toed Sawyer statue. They run towards the sound of the crash to investigate. At the same time, they show that Richard is in the heart of the island, and he uses a rope to put the cork back on the hole. So this proves that Richard was not part of the Blackrock crew at all, and his backstory from Ab Interno will be completely different in my version, and we'll have to wait till season 6 to see what that is. But we already know a lot about Richard. We know he was an Egyptian, we know he lived with the Romans, and now we see that he pretty much knows how to run the heart of the island. Just after this, many of the crew of the Blackrock are killed by the smoke monster. The smoke monster gets there pretty quick and starts killing people. Sawyer, Juliet, Jin, and Daniel arrive just outside the boat and see that everyone is scattering, but there are still about 4 people that they could rescue. And those 4 people are Captain Jonas Whitfield, his daughter Charlotte, and 2 slaves named Miguel and Carlos. Now, Charlotte will be played by Rebecca Mader. However, she will not be the same Charlotte Staples Lewis from the actual show. This will be a Charlotte. We'll review her last name in season 6. Different character, same actress. Same first name. Different character. So that's what we're gonna do there. So what they do is they run into a group of narrow trees, just like Danielle showed Kate how to do, and Kate showed Juliet how to do. So Juliet shows everybody else how to do it, and the smoke monster tries to get them. They can't, and then the smoke monster goes away. So off-island, Jack, Kate, Hurley, and Sayid appear in a downtown building district next to a sign that says Theater District. It is dark outside and they begin to walk around. There are no lights on in the city. So Jack takes out the suicide note and tries to read the next name, but it's so dark out he can't read the name. Jack asks everybody if they know where they are, and nobody has any idea. Everybody looks really tired and upset. Hurley says, "How much longer, dude? I may have chose this, but I wasn't told about this." And Jack asks Hurley how he made the choice to be there to begin with. But before he can answer, they hear a familiar sound that they do not expect to hear. They hear the sound of the smoke monster. So they run down one street away from the sound of the smoke monster, but as they run some distance past a sign that says Niagara Falls 20 minutes, meaning that they are in Buffalo, New York, there's another smoke monster. And then they look up and they see that it's actually not dark out, but there are hundreds of smoke monsters flying around the city of Buffalo. Now, before we go any further, I want to be 100% clear on something. I wrote this way before Thunderbolts came out. So if anybody thinks I'm ripping this off of Thunderbolts, I swear to you I am not. I wrote this way before I saw Thunderbolts, or there was even a trailer for it. So anyway, back to the story. Okay, so they're in the city of Buffalo. They're surrounded by smoke monsters. They have nowhere to run, so they just run down a random street as fast as they can And the smoke monsters are gaining on them, and all of a sudden, as they're running, everything turns bright, and then they're on a beach. And they look out towards the ocean, and they see that there are also a bunch of other islands in the ocean. So back to the island in 1867, or maybe 1868, because it is 9 months later, and the group of 8 have rebuilt the beach, and everyone's hanging out and having a pretty good time. Sawyer and Juliet are in a tent together, and they're reading some books. So basically, Juliet's kind of recreated her book club with Sawyer, and they're seen debating books together. Daniel and Charlotte are actually having a lot of fun together. They're actually seen having a pretty big makeout session on the beach there. And then we're going to see Jin, Jonas, Miguel, and Carlos fishing with the bamboo nets. So, as we know on the show, the Blackrock was a slaver ship, but it appears that after the course of 9 months, Jonas, Miguel, and Carlos are on good terms at that point. Juliet tells Sawyer that she can't believe she has grown to like the island thanks to him. And he's like, oh, really? And, they kind of laugh about his little flirtatious tone there. And Sawyer points out that the wheel that the Romans made is not accessible anymore, and that's why she hasn't left. It's not him. They look at Daniel and Charlotte, and they kind of become a little envious. And they realize it's been a year since they both lost Kate and Jack. And as they talk about them with fond memories, they say to each other, they're like, you know what? We really haven't spent nearly as much time with them as we have each other. And Sawyer and Juliet are about to have a possible kiss, but it's interrupted when Richard comes to the beach and drops off some ash. So the fact that Richard just shows up and nobody says anything negative and there's nothing going on means that Richard and the group have already made contact at some point during those 9 months, and everyone's on good terms. So Richard drops off some ash with the group, like a big bucket of ash, and he tells them they need to sprinkle the ash around the perimeter of their beach site, and that will keep out the smoke monster. Now, it's implied through their dialogue that this is not the first time they've been given the ash. This is like, getting an oil change, essentially. He's just like, okay, here's some more ash. You gotta just make sure you're constantly covering the area up. It is this point in the show where it is revealed that the ash that was seen around the cabin is used to keep out the smoke monster. So this is how we know what the ash was at the cabin. Juliet has still not told him that he recognizes them, nor does Richard remember seeing them 1,800 years ago in the past. He believes that they're all from the Blackrock ship. He asks if they would like to join their group, and Sawyer and Whitfield speak for the whole group, and they decline. And then they do a trade. They give Richard some fish and some boar meat as payment for the ash. So off island, we have Jack, Kate, Hurley, and Sayid walking on the beach, thinking that they are actually back on the island. But except for Jack. Jack does not think they're back on the island. And Kate and Sayid are kind of suspicious too. 1 minute they are in Smoke Monster City, the next they are here. It makes no sense. There was no portal, no light. They were just 1 minute they're in a city, the other minute they're on the beach. Like, something's not right. So Hurley looks out at the ocean and says there weren't that many islands there before either. And then they're still walking along the beach, not really saying much, and Hurley looks out and he notices that one of the islands appeared farther away this time. He asks the group if anybody else kind of noticed anything like that, and they're like, no, we don't notice anything. So Hurley looks back, and now he sees 2 of the islands closer together. He's like, hey, look, now there's 2 of them. And the rest of them look out in the ocean, they don't see anything that he's talking about. So they keep walking, but then they hear a huge sound of water, like a huge wave. And they turn, and they literally see an island out in the ocean zooming by as if that island was a jet ski or a motorized boat. Like, the island itself is just moving really quick. And then the island makes a perpendicular switch and starts coming right towards their beach. So literally, like, imagine you're on a beach, you see an island, and then the island is like coming towards you, like it's going to hit you. So they instinctively start to run away from the island that's coming towards them. And as they look out and see the island about to hit the beach, Hurley lets out a big scream. And then we go to a commercial break and go back to the island in the 1860s. Daniel is about to propose to Charlotte. So as Daniel's preparing his speech, all of a sudden the sky lights up again. And Dan tries to run over to Charlotte, but it's too late, as Sawyer, Juliet, Jen, and Dan once again time travel. Now, after they time travel, they don't know how long it's been. They look around the beach. They don't see their setup or anything like that, so they're not really optimistic. But they're like, you know what? Maybe they're at the caves. Let's go to the caves and see if they're there. So they walk to the caves, and they get to the caves, and they see that 2 bodies have been laid to rest. So Daniel, naturally thinking that it might be Charlotte, he goes up and investigates if one of those bodies is Charlotte. And what he finds is a little plaque that says Neil and Nikki. So what this is this explains who Adam and Eve are from episode 6 of season 1. But Daniel doesn't care about that. He rips up the names and throws them in anger because he's lost Charlotte. He knows now that they're in a time period after Frogert and Nikki have died, and therefore, like, Charlotte's long gone. Because they're at least 60 years in the future from where they just were. So Jen tries to comfort him and be there for him. Juliet mentions, though, that, you know, maybe the wheel is accessible now, and they all agree to walk back to the Orchid. So off island, Jack, Hurley, Kate, and Sayid all wake up in beds at a ranch in the middle of the Australian outback. They are greeted by a man named Isaac, who welcomes them from Rome. So in case anybody was wondering who Isaac is, yes, this is Isaac the Faith Healer from season 2. And very briefly in season 3, in my version. So after he welcomes them from Rome, they all looked at each other. Kate says, maybe it was all a dream. Sayid questions, the same dream? And Jack says, we've seen weirder. And Hurley just inquires directly to Isaac, do portal jumpers share dreams? And Isaac said he has never heard of that. He gives them some breakfast and says to sit tight because the next portal jump is 26 days away. They all act extremely negatively towards this and suggest they fly back to LA. And Isaac says it's more likely if they fly back to LA, they'll just be portaled to Africa or Europe. Way more likely than the island. So Jack kind of has a real talk moment with Isaac. He's like, is there something Hawking and the rest of you guys aren't saying to us? Because he can't imagine anyone being able to control their trips to the island like this. Isaac says there is a way to turn the portal on at will. And Jack says, okay, let's do that. But Isaac tells him it may not take you when you want to go. And that is the end of episode 10. So then we move on to episode 11, which is Dead is Dead, which is a Ben-centric episode. This episode combines the 2007 events of Namaste and the episode Dead is Dead, and there's also the Ben flashback. So basically all of Dead is in this, plus the Namaste few 2007 scenes, and finally also the Ben flashback is way more detailed than it is in the actual show. So here we go. So we start off in 1972 off island, but not with the time travelers, but with young Ben. We're going to see that Roger Linus takes young Ben to the hospital, and while there, Ben is receiving some electroshock therapy. And while he's there, they run into Horace Goodspeed, and Roger tells Horace about his troubles raising Ben, about his financial woes, and that's when Horace says, hey, I have a job for you if you would like a job, and Roger agrees to take it. So 2007 on island, we're going to start at Hydra Island. where Richard is there with a group of others, including Otto, who we met in Season 3 when Sawyer and Kate and Charlie escape from Hydra Island. Richard tells the group that Jacob says there might be strangers on the island, and Otto says that this is just a waste of time and he wants to move back to the barracks. He doesn't like living on Hydra Island. He doesn't like living on the temple. He just wants to go back to the barracks. And Richard says until there's a new leader, they have to follow the last direction, which was what Ben said, which was basically go to the temple. Otherwise, they gotta look for the new castaways. That's why a lot of them are not at the temple. Otto says that maybe he could be the leader, but backs down when Richard says, oh, yeah, sure, do you want to do the first test? And Otto's basically like, nah, I'm good. So as they're talking, we're going to pull out to the woods, and we'll see that Ben is there watching all of this happening. And then we're going to pull out further to see that Sun is also there watching Ben watch the others. So Ben takes off, and Sun follows him just like on the actual show, and then the rest of this starts to deviate a little bit, because remember, in my version, there's no Frank. Frank is not there because the Ajira Flight is not there. So Richard's the one that's going to notice Ben and Sun walking through the woods, and he's like, so that's who he was looking for. And Richard keeps asking Ben how he got back to the island, saying there's no way that he navigated the exits. And when Ben and Sun are preparing to paddle over to the main island, Sun still knocks out Ben with York. Sun asks if she's a prisoner, and she tells him all she wants to do is find Jin, and Richard says she's free to go. He asks if it's just her and Ben that returned, and she says yes. So Richard doesn't go with Sun. He stays with the rest of the others. He has no reason to go with Sun. And once Sun starts paddling away, he returns to the beach and says to the rest of the others that they need to continue searching for anybody else. So essentially, Richard does not believe Sun at all that they came back on their own. So Sun's interaction with Christian is by herself. Frank's not there. So you don't see what's in the picture, though. Like, Christian's going to show Sun the picture and say, you have a journey ahead of you, but you're not going to see what Sun looks at. That's going to remain a mystery for now. And when Christian grabs the picture, he does not say, there's 1977. He doesn't say that. So at this point, it's just kind of like, whoa, what's in the picture? And we have to keep watching to see what's in the picture. So back on Hydra Island, Otto and Richard bring Ben to the cot, and Otto asks Richard if Ben is the leader again, and Richard says that Ben's banishment is over, but he will never be the leader again. So they leave Ben in the cot alone, since he knows the island and he doesn't really need any more help, and the island's going to heal him anyways. So they're like, he'll be fine. And they go off to find more strangers on the island. And after the others leave, Ben is woken up by John Locke. Just like on the show, but we'll get to some differences later. So then we have our first Ben flashback to 1988, where in the flashback we're going to see Ben take Alex away from Danielle, but there are some very key differences. First off, Ben does not mention the whispers to Danielle. And second, Ben takes Jin's ring from Danielle. Remember, Jin dropped his ring, so Ben kind of fancies it when he's in Danielle's camp, so he pockets that as well. So then we basically have the exact same scene between Ben and Whitmore arguing about Alex. But there's just going to be a small logistics thing that we have to take care of here. So Ben is going to give Alex to Ethan briefly so he can reach into his pocket and take Jin's ring out and toss it over to Eloise, who is there. He'll say, here's something for your jewelry collection. And then that's it. That's basically, it's the same scene with just that tiny little difference there. So back in 2007, Ben reminds Locke that the only way to end his banishment was to get everybody who left to come back, and it appears that he failed since he only managed to bring back Sun. Ben doesn't say to Locke, that's why you left. And Locke ignores these comments, and he's completely unfazed by them. So it just changes the dialogue a little bit, because like in my version, Locke's banished, so we're going to address that here. And he never left the island willingly and to sacrifice himself or anything like that. Like so yeah, so we have to just change up that dialogue to match the rest of the story there. So again, we skip all the Ajira scenes because there are no Ajira passengers, there's no Ajira Flight. And Ben and Locke go to the main island together. When Ben enters his house, Sun doesn't show Ben the picture. She just says that Christian said to wait for John. And that's all we find out. And then, of course, Locke waves just like he does in the show. And all the Frank dialogue is negated here because Frank is not there. So then we have another Ben flashback. We're going to go to 1993. Right after Ben kills his father. Ben goes down to the Pearl Station and does the same gas on the Dharma people working at the Pearl Station. Then he looks at the monitors that are monitoring the Swan Station, and he sees Stu Rosinski and Calvin in the hatch doing the experiment on the monitors. And Ben decides not to gas them because they are already suffering a worse fate than death. So, after getting back to the barracks and telling Richard to leave his father out there, we see a scene basically shortly thereafter where Richard asks Ben how it feels to be fully one of them now, and Ben says it feels good, but he wants to know more. He wants to know what the monster is. He wants to know why his mother stopped coming to visit him. He wants to meet Jacob. And Richard explains that most of that is for leadership to know. And Ben doesn't like that answer. I mean, think about it. He just killed his father. He just killed people he probably knew at the Pearl Station. So, he's not really happy. So Ben decides to get a better answer from Charles Whitmore. So he goes over to Whitmore's tent to see if Whitmore agrees with him. And Ben hears what sounds like a struggle going on inside of Whitmore's tent. So he goes into Whitmore's tent uninvited, and they see Charles with a woman who is not one of the others. In fact, she is a woman who's from London that he brought to the island. The woman explains that her company, Faraday Industries, was intrigued by the island. So, Richard comes in and says that Charles has broken a sacred rule to not use the island for personal gain, and he is banished from the island. First banishment in a long time. Ben suggests that they use the Dharma village and the submarine, and that they can use the submarine to transport Whitmore off the island safely, and there's no reason to sleep on the ground. So Isabel comes and takes Charles away, saying she will put him in the Dharma polar bear cages for now and release the polar bears into the wild. And she can't believe she has to do this to her own brother. So it's now revealed that Isabel and Charles Whitmore are brother and sister. The others start asking about leadership. When Richard tries to calm everybody down, Ben says he would like to be the leader. Richard reminds Ben that he just got there. He just joined them. Ben reminds Richard, though, that he's actually been a spy for them for 15 years, and he just killed his own father for the island. And Richard says that if they let them do the test and he fails, he will have to be banished alongside Charles. And Ben's pretty confident, though, and he says, done. Fine, let's go. Let's do it. So after another commercial break, Richard tells Ben that he has passed the 6 things test and the knife test at the temple. We don't see that on screen, but remember, these are the same tests that John did. So the last test is the smoke monster test. That's what Richard tells Ben. Richard says, if you summon the monster and it doesn't kill you, you will be the leader. So Richard shows Ben how to enter the secret room through the house that Horace used to live in. Dharma made a secret room to study the ancient tunnels, but never found the toilet latch in the water. Richard shows Ben where it is and says, good luck. Ben turns the latch and goes outside, and the smoke monster appears. It flashes Ben with some lights and then floats away. Richard tells Ben that he is the leader now, and they will move into the barracks as requested. Richard then gives Ben the 8 rules that all leaders have to follow. Richard explains to Ben that the rules can be changed by Jacob, they can also be changed by Ben, and they could also be changed by past leaders, including Whitmore. And Ben agrees to the rules as they are presented. Alright, so we quickly go back to 2007 and we see the same scene where the monster fails to show up. It's the same scene as it was on the show. Then we go back to 1994, and in 1994 they flash back to Richard showing Ben pictures of the donkey wheel inside of the orchid. Richard explains that while volcanic sediment did block the exit, there used to be tunnels that Richard and Charles used to leave the island to do recruitment at one point. So Ben says, wait, I thought whoever moves the island can never come back. And Richard says, that's only if you move the wheel in there to the left. When you move the wheel to the left, it moves the island. If you move it to the right, the island doesn't move. But you can still leave the island. So Richard continues and says that due to Dharma mining non-metallic minerals, that's why the tunnels that they used to use are completely blocked now, and that's why they can't use the wheel anymore. But now, with the subs, they can leave. So essentially what's being said here is that in the 1860s, they didn't know where the tunnels were. So Richard continues and says that due to Dharma mining non-metallic minerals, they aren't able to get to the tunnels that lead to the old exit, but now with the subs, they can leave. But if they ever do need to get out, they just need to blow a hole in the orchid wall. So that's when we start to see, like, we're not told yet, we have to wait till season 6, but like maybe Ben's thinking about profiting off the island as well, but we'll see. Okay. So in 2007, Ben, Locke, and Son go to the temple. It's exactly the same. After Ben admits that to Locke that he did kill Alex, we flash back to another scene in 2004, though, this time. So in 2004, we're at the barracks, and Carl and Alex's families are getting together for dinner. So obviously Ben is there, but we also meet Carl's parents for the first time, named Lee and Barb. Lee is played by Robert Carlyle. Barb is played by Beverly Elliott. And Lee is the same man standing over Paulo at the end of season 2, and this is Barb's first introduction. Lee is very nervous to meet the big boss, Ben, so it's very similar to that first episode of WandaVision, if you guys have ever seen that. After dinner, Ben takes Lee aside and asks him if he likes working at the medical center with Juliet. Lee says he does. And then Ben asks if he wants an even bigger challenge, and Lee agrees, but he doesn't want to get in trouble. So he basically just agrees to anything. Ben says that he wants to send Lee and Barb to work in the temple. And as they watch Carl and Alex looking up at the stars, Ben says that Carl will take his place working with Juliet. And Lee is like, he's just a boy. And Ben asks if this is going to be a problem, and Lee says that it won't be. So this goes back to a flashback scene in season 3 where Carl was developing x-rays for Juliet. So this kind of explains how Carl is working in the medical field with everybody else. So Lee goes up to Alex and Carl while they're hanging out in the backyard, and Lee whispers something to Carl, and Carl gets up and leaves pretty upset. Ben says, well, it's time to call it an evening. Thanks for stopping by. And he shows Lee and Barb to the door. And once they're all gone, Alex comes up to Ben, extremely furious with him. Ben says to Alex that it's time for her and Carl to grow up, and she's going to start working with Tom and Pickett too. And she yells, I hate you, I wish you were dead. So then we go back to 2007 on Island, and the flashes of Ben being judged by the monster are exactly the same. except we're not going to have a scene where the ghost of Alex shows up after the monster judges Ben. And then Ben's going to tell Locke that the smoke monster once again let him live. And now you've probably noticed that I haven't talked about the scene with Desmond and Penny. That's because it's not in this episode. We're moving the scene of Desmond and Penny to episode 14. So after Ben tells Locke that the smoke monster let him live, we cut back to Australia, off island, and rejoin Jack, Kate, Sayid, and Hurley, who is at the Australian outback with Isaac. So Isaac tells the group there is a way to activate the portal early, but they will probably not be in the same time as the people they left behind. And then there's a little bit of confusion. So Hurley's like, so it's been a few years for us, but it's only going to be a few days for them. And Jack's like, no, I remember Daniel doing his experiments where time off island was a few hours difference between the island and the freighter. That's all he means. Look, we're supposed to go back, and this seems like the best way. So Isaac confirms that adjusting the portal would be about a 33% chance to get back to the island, and waiting the 3 weeks, like he suggests, or actually more like 4 weeks, it would be like an eighth of a chance to get back. So liking the odds, Jack's like, yeah, activate the portal, let's go. So Kate, Sayid, and Hurley just begrudgingly go along with it. And they go downstairs to where their portal is, and Isaac activates it. The room lights up, and the four of them, and the guitar case, remember, Hurley still has the guitar case, which is not metal, by the way, that's how he's able to carry it around, disappeared. But afterwards, we see Isaac go to his phone, he makes a phone call, and he says, Eloise, it's done. And then we see the Lost logo. Alright, so episode 12 is LaFleur, which is the Sawyer episode. The episode will have the exact same start as it did in the actual show, where we have the LaFleur reveal in 1977. So it's going to start off in Dharma times. They're going to be like, oh man, do you really want to wake up LaFleur? And then it turns out to be Sawyer. I love that scene. It's staying the same. So basically, most of the 1977 scenes are exactly the same. It's the 1976 scenes that are different. So for starters, it's 1976, not 1974, as it is on the actual show. And what's going to be happening here is they're going to be going back and forth between a time period of 1.5 years, not 3 years like it was on the actual show. So in early 1976, Daniel is still upset about losing Blackrock Charlotte. Again, played by Rebecca Mader, but not the same character. And again, the beginning has a different start because they're inversing what they did on the actual show. They're going from the beach back to the orchid here. So just a reminder, Miles is not in any of the dialogue, because I know Miles had a lot of lines in this episode. So all of his lines are going to go to Jin. And I just want to say before we keep going that they should go to Jin. First of all, Jin has been time traveling with them for 1.5 years now. He's already pretty good at English. That's number one. Number two is, yeah, I mean, there was so much this season that went to Miles, who was this character who's only been on the show for 1.5 years, when Jin's been there the whole time, and Jin was sidelined most of this season, and that was so frustrating. But anyways, I just wanted to say that. So most of Miles' dialogue, with the exception of like the smart quirks that he has and all that fun stuff, it goes to Jin. So like the stuff that actually matters. There's also no talk about waiting for Locke to bring everybody back, because remember, Locke never time traveled, so all that dialogue's removed. Now here's another important thing. There's no truce about burying people. That's removed. There's also no talk about the flashes stopping. So remember, in the LaFleur episode, they're like, oh, it's over. We're here for good now. But remember, in my version, they're still time traveling. Their problems haven't been fixed yet. When they get to the Dharma barracks and they're waiting outside when Sawyer is talking to Horace, Juliet talks to Jin about her time living with the others in the barracks, not Miles. So basically the same conversation, except it's Jin asking Juliet about her time in the barracks. And again, there's no conversation about like no more flash or anything like that. So then Sawyer and Richard's conversation is also different because they don't discuss Locke at all. But Sawyer does bring up the bomb in the 50s, and that gets Richard's respect and attention. And Sawyer says they will give him Paul for the men that they killed in self-defense. So, and I remember Richard doesn't recognize any of them. It's been over 100 years since they saw them, so Richard doesn't remember seeing them 100 years ago. So after Sawyer talks to Richard and goes down to the dock to talk to Juliet, in Sawyer's mind, when Jen was found a year and a half ago, Sawyer believes that Kate and several others may have also survived the boat explosion just like Jen did. So when he goes down there, he says to Juliet, like, I bought us 2 weeks. Hopefully we can find Rose and Bernard by then. And Juliet says, I doubt it. It's been a year and a half since we've seen them. So in between the scene where Sawyer goes to talk to Horace and the wake-up scene. Oh, and by the way, so I know this is on the actual show. And remember, always assume that if I name an episode, if I don't talk about it, it's in the actual show. Sawyer and Juliet do get together the same exact way. So if you think that's not happening, it is. It's the same thing. So in between the scene where Sawyer talks to Horace and the wake-up scene, that's when we see Jack wake up in the bamboo forest. And he rescues Hurley in the lagoon and wakes up Kate. And, they're all like, wow, it actually worked. And, and then it's just so much more satisfying in this version because it's episode 12 at this point. It's not episode 6. So, they really did go on a journey to get back to the island. So I just want to throw that out there. So they're like, whoa, it's just the three of us. And they're wondering what happened to Sayid. Because remember, Sayid's been with them the whole time. And then they plan to search for Sayid. They're still wondering about Sun. And that's when the Dharma van approaches. And they see that it's Jin. So then the episode ends with Sawyer getting the phone call from Jin, and then he goes out to the North Point and sees Kate for the first time since episode 4 that season, and that's the end of the episode. So then we go to episode 13, which is Namaste, which is a Kate-centric episode. This episode combines the events of Namaste in 1977 and the Kate flashback from the Whatever Happened Happened episode. So, in 1977, when they all sort of meet up with each other, Sawyer says that they're in 1977, and it's Kate that brings up that Locke said that you all needed help, but I guess he was just full of it since you're all okay. And Sawyer asks if Locke is with him, but Jack says he's dead. Then Hurley asks about the Dharma stuff, and Sawyer's confused. Sawyer thinks that they've been in the jungle all this time. And Sawyer asks where they've been for the past 3 years and stuff like that. So, I should emphasize here, I'm going to just go behind the scenes with you guys for a couple seconds here. I originally wanted the time differences to be different. I wanted the time on the island to be 2 years and their time off the island to be 3. But it has to be 3 for both. So they're going to have the same line where they're like, how long has it been since the chopper? 3 years. And how long have you been off the island? 3 years. It's the same exact amount of time, which I never liked, but I found something that makes it so it has to match up. And you'll see why at the very end. So yeah, so they had the same exact discussion where they established that Kate, Jack, and Hurley were actually been off island for 3 years, where they've been on the island for 3 years. So that kind of clarifies that they were rescued, and Sawyer didn't even realize that after all this time. Then they also clarified that Sayid, Ben, and Sun also came back with them, and that's when, Jen was like, whoa, Sun's here? And Jen's like, you said you didn't know where Sun was. He says that to Jack, Kate, and Hurley, and Hurley's like, we know she tried to come back, but we don't know where she is now. So there was like a little lost and mixed confusion there. So Jen takes off with the Jeep to go look for Sun on the security cameras. He doesn't look for a plane. There's no plane. He does not go to the Flame and talk to Rosinski. He goes to the security room. And that's where Juliet shows up and asks Jen what's going on. And he says that he's looking for Sun on the monitors. Now, Juliet basically points out that Jen does this every single day, so she doesn't think it's anything different. So she asks why he called James so early, and Jen tells her that it's best if she hears it from him. So back in 2007, the beginning's going to be exactly the same. We'll see Kate go visit Cassidy, and that's what you see. That's what you see here, and then we'll see the scene where Kate goes to the supermarket with Aaron. But then we have the divergence. Here comes the big change. In my version, Kate actually does lose Aaron at the supermarket. So when he goes missing, she can't find him. So she goes home completely distraught, and she gets a phone call from an unknown caller. And the unknown caller says, if you ever want to see Aaron again, you need to return to the island with Jack. It's a male voice on the phone, and then that's all the voice says. We don't get a scene of Kate going back to Cassidy's house, and it actually makes sense that she doesn't, because after the trial she can't leave the state. So I mean, it's implied that Cassidy might be living in Albuquerque, so yeah, she can't leave the state to go visit her. So then Kate just returns back to the island with Jack per the instruction on the phone. Since Kate has lost Aaron, she also doesn't give him to Claire's mom, so that scene's deleted because, again, she doesn't have Aaron, so therefore she can't give him away to Claire's mom. So back in 1977, we get the picture scene, and then we see them say Namaste, and they take the picture, and then it's quickly revealed that was the same picture that Sun was looking at in 2007. So they show what she saw. So basically, we know now that Sun Sun knows where they are. Basically, that's what we're told here. So again, there's no mention of a plane crash. Sayid makes no appearance in this episode. He's not captured. He's not taken as a hostile or anything like that. He just stays in the woods, basically, for a couple of episodes. Now, Phil is a little bit more observant in my version. He's going to see Jack go to LaFleur's house, and he's also going to see Sawyer go over to Kate's house. And Phil's going to note that. He's going to be like, okay, what's going on here? Like, why is he being so friendly with the new recruits? So when Jack goes to Sawyer, he wants to know if Jen found Sun, and he also wants to know if they found Sayid on the security tapes, and he's like, no luck yet. And that's when they basically have the exact same argument they do on the show. So then we go to Jen's house. Jen's trying to call it a night after trying to find Sun on the monitors, but he basically has to give up. And the episode ends with Pierre Chang calling Jin at the house and saying, Jin, you need to go down to the sub to pick up somebody who is still on the sub, and they have like a bunch of luggage. So Jin goes down to help out, and it is revealed that Daniel Faraday has returned to the island on the sub. And that's the end of the episode. Alright, so episode 14 is The Variable, which is a Dan-centric episode. And now, The Variable will start off with the scene from Dead is Dead where Ben calls Whitmore to say he's going back to the island and that he's going to kill his daughter. Then we see Ben shoot Desmond on the way to the boat. He tries to kill Penny, but then he sees young Charlie, decides not to kill Penny, and then Desmond beats him up. Then we are immediately at the hospital where Desmond is being taken into the hospital, and Eloise is there to check in on Penny. And then The Variable is about the same as it is on the actual episode, with the exception of the following things, and there are quite a few exceptions here. So the episode also has Jin telling Dan that everybody's only been back a day, not a few days. So remember, they just got back. And Dan asks Jin to take him to Jack's immediately. He saw that the name changes on the sub manifest. He wants to talk to Jack right now. And Jin tells Daniel, relax, it's the middle of the night, it's been a long day, for everybody just come home and we'll go talk to Jack in the morning. And Jin and Dan share a house together. So during Variable, I'm adding the Jack and Juliet shower scene from the episode Whatever Happened. So yeah, Jack and Juliet, they hugged and everything the night before, but Juliet is not happy that they're back on the island, so she wants answers. So she goes over, and when Jack gets out of the shower, Juliet's in the bathroom waiting for him, and she's basically like... Now, again, in my version, if it hasn't been clear yet, there is no young Ben that gets shot by Sayid or anybody, so there's never a dying Ben Linus kid. So Juliet's not mad about that. She's just mad that they're back, and she's just like, you came for you, we didn't need saving, what are you here for? What are you doing? And, Jack's like, I don't know yet, la-di-da-di-da. So the second scene is Jack, Kate, and Hurley having breakfast. It's the same scene from the episode He's Our You. And then we also have the scene of Kate and Juliet at the motor pool, and it'll be the scene where Juliet says, oh, I didn't know how to talk to you without saying stay away. So that scene from He's Our You is also there. And then we see Jack at the school about to do his cleaning. And then we finally have our divergent moment. So Daniel goes into the school and asks Jack how he got back to the island. And Jack tells him it was the portals that brought us back. They light up. They take them random places. Eventually they got here. And Dan says the Romans were right. And Jack questions him. He's like, what? What Romans? What are you talking about? But Dan ignores him. Dan asks, who told you how to get back here? And Jack said it was actually your mother. And Dan says that his mom was wrong to send him back. So the next scene, we have Jin driving Dan out to the orchard to talk to Pierre Chang. Now remember, Daniel was the one that created the donkey wheel with Esau back in the Roman times. So he knows where it is and he wants access to it to see if they can try to control the time jumps and jump again. But once Daniel realizes what's going on and that they really can't access the wheel, or at least he doesn't think they can, he thinks that it's too dangerous to even attempt using the wheel. Again, I already said this, there's no shot young Ben Linus, and Sayid's in the island still unknown. So nobody got exposed, and therefore Phil is not locked up at the house. So I just want to point that out, because in the episode, Phil's locked in the house. So then we have a Daniel flashback, and we see that Eloise sent Daniel to live in the monastery when he was born, and she stayed on the island. So remember the monastery in season 3 where Desmond was working? It turns out that Daniel Faraday was raised there by the monks. And Whitmore had connections to the monastery through Faraday Industries, which was already established at that episode as well. So the piano scene that we see actually takes place at the monastery, not the house, but we do see young Eloise visiting Daniel there. So we'll just do the flashbacks now. So before entering Daniel's house later in the episode in the flashback, we see Whitmore talking to Ruth on the phone, recruiting her to be on the freighter. And Whitmore tells Ruth that they can find Desmond together, but to never use his name or else he will never trust her, so he needs her to use Penny's name instead. So then it will be revealed that Daniel's caretaker in the flashback is Penny's mother and Charles's former lover, the head of Faraday Industries. The reason Daniel and his lab assistant were sick is because she and Dan ironically exposed themselves to radiation. Only the mouse was the thing that time traveled. Neither Dan or his lab assistant time traveled. They just exposed themselves to radiation. So Charles and his ex-girlfriend Caroline Faraday are on good enough terms for her to take care of Daniel. And Caroline Faraday, again, is the mother of Penny. So back in 1977, Pierre Chang actually believes Daniel Faraday. He knows that they can manipulate time, so meeting a time traveler is not that far-fetched. Chang insists on making a video, though, to Future Dharma in order to help Future Dharma out. And there's no mention of Miles in this episode because he's not a character, remember. So we see Daniel and Pierre make the video, and it's the same scene that was played at Comic-Con that year. There's no crying baby in the video because there's no Miles. So after Daniel tells Patty, the cameraman, to stop recording, he says there's going to be an incident in 5 hours and all non-essential personnel need to be evacuated from the island while the sub is still there. Pierre says he told them to stop drilling at the Orchid, and Daniel lies and says it'll be at the Swan site, an even bigger time-traveling site they don't know about yet, just like Stu had predicted. So after Daniel leaves Pierre's house, Daniel, Sawyer, Juliet, Jen, Jack, Kate, and Hurley meet at Sawyer's house. Dan calls the meeting not Sawyer. And since he tells a different story to the group, it's clear to the audience that Daniel isn't telling the complete truth here. Daniel says that they will all time travel again soon, and they will be split up, because remember, it's only the 4 of them time traveling, and the rest of them will stay in 1977. All of Miles' dialogue is replaced with Jin talking instead, and Jin is not Pierre's son, so there's no talk about any Pierre Chang connection here. Daniel will say, so by my calculations, we have a matter of days before we time travel again. Sawyer asks if they caused this, meaning Jack and the others coming back to the island. And Daniel says no, their arrival is completely by chance. Juliet asks, what if we leave the island by sub? And Daniel says, I don't know, but I would say there's a better chance of you not time traveling off island than on island. And then Sawyer says, all right, people, party's over. So their dialogue has no mention of Phil, because Phil is not in the house or anything like that. Sawyer suggests that they can either stay on the island or get on the sub and leave. Jin votes to stay, and whatever happens to him happens. Hurley says he's going to stay because they just got there. But Sawyer and Juliet actually say they're going to get on the sub, and hoping that the real world they won't time travel. So again, they're getting on the sub because this is a different circumstance. Like, they haven't been caught yet or anything like that, but they're going to leave. Like, their lives are over, according to Daniel, because they're going to time travel again. So one way or another, they're going to leave the barracks. So they're just like, you know what, we're just going to leave. Because remember, Juliet wanted to leave back in the Roman time. She wanted to leave a year and a half ago. So they're going with Juliet's plan. They're like, we're getting on the sub. We're out of here. But there's still some of that residual Kate stuff going on, because Jack asks Kate if she knows where the hostiles are because of how she worked with them 3 years ago. And Sawyer says, no, you know, come on the sub with us, Kate. And Juliet gives them directions to the others based on her knowledge of being with them, because she's a former other. And there's no mention of the Ben shooting because that's deleted from my version. So when Daniel says his mom is the only one who can get them back to where they belong, he's doing a truth and a lie here. He does need to know where the bomb is, but he also wants to save her from being blown up. So Kate and Jack decide to help Daniel talk to his mother. Dan asks Jin to drive them, and Jin gives Daniel the keys and tells him good luck. And that's kind of a more like goodbye forever type of scene. It's a touching scene, kind of, actually, because remember, Dan and Jin shared a house together, and they obviously became good friends off screen. Dan never talks to a toddler Charlotte because that character does not exist, so just any of that does not happen. So then we have Stuart Rosinski saying that, so then we have a scene of Stuart Rosinski talking to Pierre Chang at his house to not drill based on what they found at the Orchid, but Stuart says there's no evidence of the issues going on at the Orchid going on at the Swan, which makes sense because the Swan is a dud. Of course they're not going to have the electromagnetism there. The problems start, though, the same way they do on the show, with Jack, Kate, and Daniel fighting Dharma. So that's where, like, sound the alarm and, you know, Stuart gets shot and stuff. So Phil tells Stu that he saw Jack and Kate talking to LaFleur and Juliet. So he puts it together that I think my boss, LaFleur, and Juliet might have something to do with this. And remember, they got here the same time that Daniel did. And they also noticed that, so that means that Sawyer, Jin, and Juliet all need to be found. But they go over to Sawyer's house while they're packing, and they quickly capture Sawyer and Juliet. But Jin is able to get away, and he and Hurley stay out of sight. Horace reminds Stu and Phil that LaFleur is chief of security, and they might be, being a little brutal here. But they overrule him and say that they have to question him. So like the show, they can't find Jin. Hurley is not suspected at first because he came in with a large group of people. But the manifest differences is discovered, so he goes off with Jin. When Jack asks Dan why his mother was wrong, Dan says that he just convinced Chang there will be an incident at the Swan, which is a lie. The truth is that the one variable that stops them from time traveling and stops the plane from crashing is if the island did not exist in 2004. All Daniel wants to do is evacuate the island to save as many present lives as possible. Then he wants to actually blow up the island with the nuclear bomb before they time travel again, and suggest that, like in the beginning, they're going to start time traveling faster by his calculations. He compares it to throwing a ball up in the air. He basically says that right now the ball is at its peak. It'll go slower as it goes up in the air, which is why they've barely time traveled in the past year and a half or so. What's going to start happening is the ball's going to start coming down. And when the ball comes down, time travel faster and faster until they are always time traveling, and then they'll die just like Brandon did and Charlie did and George did. The reason they died so much quicker is because they had direct contact with the border of the island, whereas they were in the water. So that's why he wants to go see his mother, to tell her to leave the island so she can survive as well. And he also tells Jack and Kate that if they don't do this soon, they're going to time travel to who knows where, and they're just going to be stuck by themselves in 1977. So there's a deleted scene from the actual show where Daniel throws a boulder into the creek to explain that, like, if you throw a boulder in, it'll change the stream. I'm going to keep that scene in my version just to try to show, to visually show, like, what the variable is in this case, which is, this case is the nuclear bomb. So basically what he's saying is that blowing up the island, the plane will never crash, and therefore no one will ever time travel to begin with. And then the rest of the episode unfortunately goes exactly the same, and Daniel's killed by his own mother, and that's when the episode ends. So then we get episode 15, which is Follow the Leader, which is a Sayid episode. So all the 2007 on-island scenes with Ben and Locke and Son, that's going to be moved to the next episode. So this episode is going to go back and forth between the island in 1977 and a Sayid flash forward back in between 2006 and 2007. So the Jack, Kate, Sayid, Richard, Whitmore, and Eloise scenes from 1977 basically go exactly the same. Eloise gives the order to help because she wants to save her son, and she believes that if she saves her son, then the island being blown up will also reverse because they won't have been there to blow up the island to begin with. Now, once Sayid arrives to save Kate from being shot by the other, then we see the Sayid flashbacks, and we have 3 Sayid flashbacks, and most of them are borrowed from the He's Are You episode. The first Sayid flashback is the last time he works for Ben in Russia, where he kills one of Whitmore's men, and then Ben's like, mission accomplished, go on with your life. And then the second flashback is going to be when Ben comes to visit Sayid in Santo Domingo and tells him that Locke is dead. Now, the third flashback is going to be the most important one. Sayid is at that same bar that he was in the actual show, drinking the McCutcheon, and he is joined at the bar by Richard Melkin. Do you guys remember who Richard Melkin is? Richard Melkin is Claire's psychic from season 1, and Echo briefly meets him in season 2. So, Melkin sits next to Sayid, and again, Sayid's a little tipsy at this point, and Melkin asks Sayid, he tells him he's a psychic and everything, and Melkin asks Sayid, if you could have anything in the world, what could it be? And Sayid says that he would have his wife back. Melkin says to Sayid, be true to yourself. Are you sure that there's not someone more that you want? And Sayid doesn't say it, but the implication here is that Melkin's actually talking about Shannon and not Nadia. Melkin promises Sayid, if you return to the island, then you will have an opportunity to be with her again. However, if you don't go back, it won't happen. And then Melkin leaves the bar, and then that's the end of the flashbacks. I want to make it very clear here. Melkin never mentions Shannon. It's never verbally said out loud. Just like on the actual show, it was never verbally said out loud. It's basically the same implication, though. It's a little bit more direct in this case. It's more direct in this case because Sayid actually does say he wants Nadia back, but Melkin kind of questions that. So that's even a bigger implication that he wants Shannon. So then we move on to episode 16 and 17, which is The Incident, which is a Jacob-centric episode. So in 1867, the episode starts off with young Jacob seeing the Blackrock approach the island from the four-toed Sawyer statue. There's no Man in Black in this episode. There's no Esau in this episode. What we're going to see is Richard come up to Jacob and report that the cork is where it should be, so they are ready for the Blackrock to get to the island, because the border's down now. Richard asks Jacob why they keep bringing people to the island when he can leave himself to find what he wants. The people coming have always been corrupt, but Jacob says to Richard that each time there's progress. Richard points out that they need somebody in case something happens to either one of them. Somebody who can sense the future, someone who can sense the island, and someone who won't be killed by the smoke monster. They agree that maybe they'll find that person on the boat. Now, young Jacob here is going to be played by the same actor as on the actual show. However, even though it's a Jacob-centric episode, most of the Jacob flashes are going to be removed. So, at this point, assume that all the Jacob flashbacks are gone unless I mention the flashback. So in other words, Jacob's not going to meet Jack. Jacob's not going to meet Kate. Jacob's not going to meet Sayid. Jacob's not going to meet Sun and Jin, etc. Okay? Just all those scenes are deleted from my version. Alright, so in 2007, all of the Locke/other scenes from 2007 from Follow the Leader are moved to this episode, as I mentioned before. Though there are several scenes that are different. We'll get into that right now. So, in 2007 episode, The Incident, the entire episode takes place in one day. So, it's daylight until the very end of the episode. I also should mention at this time that when they go to find Jacob, they're going to be traveling clockwise around the island, okay? They're going to be going from east to west. If you actually look at their movements on the actual show, it really makes no sense the direction that they walk in. So just keep that in mind. They're going to be going clockwise around the island. So in the episode, the others are still looking for visitors to the island, but this time they are on the main island searching the former survivors' beach camp. So that explains why the beach camp was ransacked when they were time traveling in the first episode of the season. So when they can't find any sign of anybody at the beach, they decide to go look in the caves and the hatch to see if they can find anybody. But that's when we have the time traveling Sawyer, Juliet, Bernard, Rose, and Dan show up from episode 4, and they take the outrigger. When the others come back to the beach, they see that their outrigger was taken, so they chase after it, they shoot at the outrigger. Juliet shoots back and hits one of them on the shoulder. They get distracted, and then they don't actually see Sawyer and the rest of them time travel. They just can't find them. They're like, whoa, where'd they go? So they paddle back to Richard's camp, and they see that they've been shot, and he advises them to take the injured party to the temple so they can get healed in the healing water there. So another named Vanessa explains what happened to Richard, saying that the visitors disappeared with their boat. And around that time, that's when Locke, Ben, and Sun approach the camp. Since Sun has already met Richard, she doesn't ask who he is, and she doesn't show him the photo, and Richard never says he watches them all die. They don't interact with each other. It starts the same way, except Richard is now surprised to see Locke. And this time, Locke says he's the leader. He's very definitive about it. And Richard reminds Locke that he failed the water test, but in mid-sentence, Locke cuts his hand, shows it to Richard, and his hand heals immediately. And Locke says, I saw the monster on day 4 of the island, it let me live. It saw me just now with Ben and let me live again, so I've passed all your tests. So Richard, on the spot, he's surrounded by all the others. Everyone's pretty impressed with Locke at this point. So Richard nervously declares Locke is the leader again. So there's no scene of Locke going off to see his time-traveling self because, remember, Locke never time travels, so there's no need for that scene. So the second scene is Locke telling Richard that he wants to go see Jacob. And before Richard can really say anything to him about it, he tells the group that Richard has agreed to show him the way, and Richard hadn't even agreed to anything yet. So it was really putting Richard on the spot here. And now, remember, this scene takes place in the daytime in my version, not night. I know in the actual show this was a nighttime scene, but in my version it's daytime. So Sun asks Locke in front of everybody if Jacob can get Jin back. And Locke says that he can, and he promises to bring Jin and everyone else back. There's no scene of Locke. Okay, so here's a big difference here, a really big difference. There's no scene of Locke telling Ben he wants to kill Jacob. In fact, there's no talk at all about killing Jacob. So that's a huge difference in my version. So on the way to see Jacob, when they stop at the Survivors Beach camp, There's no conversation about seeing a hatch door because the hatch never imploded, so therefore the quarantine door is never at the beach. So then we have a flashback scene to 1942 Russia. And in that scene, we have Jacob and Alana. Now, yes, this is Alana from the Ajira plane. This is Alana that was on the island as one of the bodyguards. However, this is Alana's only scene of the show at this point. Remember, there's no Ajira Flight. There's no bodyguards of Jacob. There's none of that, okay? So Alana's only seen in this flashback all bandaged up. And that's all we're going to see from her. So Jacob and Alana flashback is basically exactly the same, except you can kind of tell that the time period is about World War II. And in 1977, everything's pretty much going exactly the same until Kate, Juliet, and Sawyer run into Rose, Bernard, and Vincent. Now, the reason it's different is that it's going to be revealed that Rose and Bernard have been staying in Jacob's cabin in the 70s, okay? And actually, it was initially built, or started to get built during the Roman era. And then Rose and Bernard give their backstory of where they've been all this time. So Rose and Bernard say that after they were captured by the Egyptians, they were able to make a living in the community of the Egyptians with Bernard's work as a dentist. Like, the ancient Egyptians really liked having a dentist, so they were able to live kind of in what they could consider luxury at the time. And they lived in a camp where there was a particle displacement orb in the center of their little community. And if you look at it, the light kind of scatters not quite right, and you actually can't see what's behind it. So, but it floated. They never really understood like why it was there or anything like that. It was just this floating orb. So when they time traveled to Roman time, the particle displacement orb was actually located on the ground. So, and then they discovered that when the Romans were trying to capture them, they went behind the particle displacement orb, and the Romans could not see them. So they realized that, oh, look at that. If we actually stand over here, like, we can't be seen. So they used the particle displacement orb to keep themselves hidden from the Romans. And I guess the Romans just didn't notice the orb. So once they started to survive on their own during the Roman time, they decided that's what they wanted to do. So they stayed separate from everybody. So they were able to survive on their own. And then when they time traveled to 1867, they met Richard. And Richard respected the fact that Rose and Bernard wanted to be left alone. And they also told Richard not to tell the others that they were there. And then they revealed that when Rose and Bernard time traveled to the 70s, they actually did meet Horace. Horace assumed that they were with LaFleur's boat, and Bernard and Rose lie and say, yep, LaFleur, he's our boat captain. And they made a mutual agreement because Bernard and Rose show Horace the orb. There's like, here's this amazing scientific discovery here that you can study. And also, Horace wanted to have a cabin out there to get away from the Dharma Initiative every once in a while. So they came up with an agreement. The agreement was Bernard and Rose would live in the cabin in secret as long as they vacated the cabin whenever Horace wanted to come up and use it. And in return, Horace would bring them food and supplies every once in a while, which is why there's Dharma food and supplies everywhere actually in the actual show. So that's what's been going on with Rose and Bernard. So still in the 70s, while they're getting the bomb ready to go, Richard never asks Jack about Locke being special or anything like that. Pierre Chang actually does follow Jin and Hurley in the barracks, and he wants to double check that Faraday knew what he was talking about, and Jin tells Pierre Chang that yes, Daniel knows what he's talking about and they need to evacuate the island. And then we have that amazing Hurley and Pierre Chang scene where Hurley has no idea that Jimmy Carter's the president, and he's like, okay, fine, we're from the future. And again, Jin lies and says that Dan was right about the Swan electromagnetic event. So then we're going to have Jack, Sayid, Jin, and Hurley. They're able to escape Dharma without a firefight. The hiding in plain sight works. So while they're on their way to the Swan, Jack and Sayid are more upfront with Jin and Hurley about what they're doing. And Jin accepts it as a good idea because he believes it's a good idea to reset everything so we can get back to Sun. But Hurley isn't as sure. Hurley's kind of thinking that this whole thing might be a little silly. So the reason, again, now just to make this clear, the reason they're using the Swan site, they know that the button was not real. So they know that the whole area is not electromagnetic sensitive like the rest of the island is. But they needed a deep enough hole, kind of like at the Orchid, so they could put the bomb down there and the island would blow up without being near other sources, because they also didn't want the nuclear energy to go through the portal wheel and like affect other areas of the planet. So after Sawyer and Jack have their fight and everything, Hurley asks the group, if we blow up the island so we never crash, then how do we end up here right now to make sure we blow up the island? And nobody can really answer this paradox. And Hurley says, I'm glad we thought this through. So, that kind of steals the Miles line there. And when Hurley says this, though, Jack again asks Hurley, if that's how you feel about all this, then why did you choose to come back in the first place? So then we have our other flashback to Hurley getting out of jail. So 2007, off island, when Hurley is let out of jail, he gets into a cab that has nobody in the cab with him. And as the cab's about to drive off, we see Jack's grandfather, Ray, get into Hurley's cab with him, and Ray has the guitar case. And he says that he's escaped from the old folks' home, just like Hurley escaped from the mental institution. Ray says he saw Hurley on the news. So when Ray's talking about the old folks' home, Hurley actually thinks that Ray's talking about the jail. When Ray asks Hurley why he left the mental institution, Hurley decides to have a little bit of a breakdown, and he starts telling Ray about all the problems happening to him, and he basically says he's cursed. But Ray suggests that he's blessed and not cursed. Ray says that it sounds like all the bad stuff happening to him is because he's not going back to the island he mentioned. And Ray asks him, wouldn't going back to this tropical paradise end your misery? And Hurley doesn't answer. So just then they pass the church and they stop at a red light, and Hurley sees both Sayid and Kate going into the church. And Hurley thinks this is really strange, and that's when Ray asks to get dropped off, and he leaves the guitar case in the cab. And when Hurley's like, whoa, don't you want your guitar case back? Ray says that it's not his guitar case, and he leaves it. And when Hurley tries to tell him that, dude, you entered the car with the guitar case. This is clearly your guitar case. Ray completely ignores him and wanders off. So Hurley, when the cab keeps going down the street and Hurley's by himself in the cab, and Hurley decides to look inside the guitar case. We don't see what Hurley sees. But Hurley shuts the guitar case, he thinks about what he looked at, and then he tells the cab driver to take him back to the church. So 2007 on island, Locke asks Ben about the cabin because it wasn't one of the original tests. So how did he know about it? So Ben says that he once followed Richard to the cabin, and he hoped that the night that Locke asked him to see Jacob, that Jacob would be there. And when Jacob wasn't there, that's when he pretended. So when Richard asks Locke how he's alive, Locke says if anybody should know that answer, it should be you. And the reason Locke says that is he knows Richard had the same history. So Locke somehow knows that Richard was brought back to the island as a mummy. Richard says back that he never knew anybody that was brought back to the dead, Locke says, well, I've never seen anybody who doesn't age. And Richard says that he has not been able to age as far back as he can remember. Locke says to Richard, wouldn't you like to find out from Jacob why you don't age? Don't you want to find out from Jacob why I'm back here? And Richard doesn't answer. And there's no mention of the Ajira Flight either. Remember in the actual episode, Locke's like, we have to take care of the Ajira Flight people. That's obviously not said because there is no Ajira Flight. So back in 1977, Phil never radios Stuart. Phil just decides to send a security team to the Swan just to be on the safe side. And look for Jack and any of his friends that might be there. So Sayid wants to be the one to deploy the bomb, but Jack tells Sayid that he needs to be the backup because he's the only other one who knows how to do it. And Sayid does not argue with this plan. So then we finally get back to 2007 and it's finally nighttime. Locke does take Ben with him to see Jacob. And the reason for this is Locke tells Ben, you brought me to see Jacob. Now it's my turn to return the favor. But Locke says this to Ben in a very nasty way because he knows that it'll probably be a negative experience for Ben. So then we go back to 1977. Now, Kate does not really want to save lives, but she also wants Aaron back, and she does not want to go to jail. So that's why she's against blowing up the island. When Jack says that Aaron could be with Claire again, that's when Kate kind of goes along with a plan to blow up the island. So when Jack goes down and tries to throw the bomb in the hole and gets shot at almost immediately, that's when Kate, Juliet, Sawyer, Jin, and Sayid come down to help out with guns. The van stays back in this case. Like, the van's not driven down or anything like that. So basically, Hurley stays back with the van and they just run in and help. Like, they don't drive in like they do on the show. So Pierre Chang loses his arm when he tries to stop the drill and it comes apart. There's never any electromagnetic event, even though Stu is like, we hit the pocket! He's wrong. So once they overpower Dharma, we flash back to 2007, where Locke and Jacob meet. So Locke and Ben walk into the chamber that's underneath the four-toed Sawyer statue, and they see a man in shadow sitting in the corner. And Locke says, hello, Jacob. The man stands up and comes out from behind the shadows. And we look up and see that the person who responds to the name of Jacob is Ray Shepard, Jack's grandfather. So yes, so before we go on, yes, this is confirmed. In my version of Lost, Jacob is the grandfather of Jack. So Locke says, hello, Jacob. And Ray says, why, hello, John, or should I call you? No, Locke interrupts. I haven't been called that in a long time, so my second name will do. In fact, this is all very new to me. I get out of the coffin, and I know everything about you, except where you were and how to bring the others back. So remember, Ben is still here, so Ben is very confused by all this, and he asks if they know each other. Ray says, Benjamin, you have a choice. You can either stay here and listen and be quiet, or you can leave and let us deal with our issues. And Ben's pretty upset by this rudeness displayed to him by Jacob. And he says, oh, okay, so now you're going to stop ignoring me. I followed all those lists, and I was told to be patient. I get sick one time, and Richard pulls me aside after rescuing me from Whitmore, only to tell me that I was banished just like him. But when he asks to see you, he gets marched up here like he was Moses. So why him? What was so wrong with me? What about me? Ray says, what about you? And Ben says, well. And then he turns and he leaves the room. So he doesn't stab Jacob, he doesn't kill him, he doesn't do that. He just is very hurt. And he's just like, wow. Like, after all that, I'm out of here. So he turns and leaves the room, and he basically is questioning his love for the island and all the choices he's made in his entire life. So Ray continues talking as if Ben was never even there. Is that why you are here? To bring my grandson back to the future? And Locke, frowning, says, for starters. And Ray smiles and says, that is something I am able to do. Follow me. So in 1977, we see Jack drop the bomb and nothing happens. Then we cut back to 2007. Ray and Locke reach the end of a tunnel to get to the donkey wheel room. Ray explains, after the Romans made the wheel, I knew it would be a matter of time before their tunnels would collapse. Luckily, the Sui dynasty made this tunnel afterwards from here to the Jacob statue. I know. This is a statue of James Ford made by the Egyptians, but because James is the Western European name derived from the Hebrew name Jacob, I like to refer to it as the statue of Jacob. So this basically explains why Jacob's living in the shadow of the statue. He likes the fact that the statue was built after somebody that shares a common name with him, basically. So Locke asks, you don't tell the leaders about the tunnel? Ray says, not since Whitmore betrayed the island, but you already knew that. The donkey wheel is still actually moving, but at a much slower rate than before. Ray says, Ben knocked the wheel off the axis when he moved the island, and even though you thought you knocked it back in place when you moved the island, it wasn't quite all the way back in place. It slowed their time travel down, but not so much. Look underneath it. The Romans were clever, or maybe it was Daniel, I don't know. He put an arrow at the bottom of the wheel so it would line up to the correct axis. So all you have to do is pick it up a little bit and line it up, and your friends will come home. So Locke approaches the wheel. And then Ray asks Locke, why do you want to help him, given that you know what's about to happen next? And Locke says, what's good being a leader if not able to make the tough choices? So back in 1977, after Jack drops the bomb and it doesn't go off, Sayid reminds everybody that he's a communications officer, not a nuclear specialist. But he suggests that they go down there to hit the bomb manually, and they realize one of them has to climb down there to set the bomb off. Kate immediately volunteers, but Juliet says, no, I'll do it. I have martial arts training, and martial arts teaches you how to climb decent rope. So they put her in a cord nearby and start to lower her down. So back in 2007, Locke straightens out the wheel and lines it up perfectly. Now, remember at the beginning of, or a few episodes ago, I said that the 3 years thing has to be even, that Jack and his group was gone 3 years and Sawyer and his group have been time traveling for 3 years. This is why. Because the amount of time that happened for everybody needs to be 3 years. 3 years from the time that the wheel was turned. So essentially the times line up if you go linearly from that time spot. So immediately after Locke straightens out the wheel, we go back to 1977 and we see that Sawyer and Jin start to light up. So they immediately start the process of time traveling. Without realizing it would be to the present, which is why they physically light up this time. They are immediately concerned that Juliet will not be able to time travel and will be trapped underground. So even though they do not see her light up at all, they are still concerned because she's underground. Like whether she time travels or not, like she could be in the middle of the dirt. So the Dharma folks, clearly seeing Jin and Sawyer lighting up with a bright light, they evacuate. They get themselves out of there. They grab Pierre Chang. They carry him to a jeep. So there's no electromagnetic event going on, but there is some weird, crazy stuff happening to Sawyer and Jin. So the Dharma folks don't stick around to find out. They're just like, we got to get out of here. We don't know what's happening to these guys. So in that little crater where they're building the hatch, only Sayid, Jack, Kate, and Sawyer remain. Jin runs back to the Dharma van where Hurley is to get cable to see if they can use that to bring Juliet back up. So as they're trying to get Juliet back up, again, Juliet's not lighting up, but Sawyer is. So Jack, Kate, Sayid, and Sawyer try to pull up Juliet, but before they're able to do so, all four of them time travel. And the reason all four of them time travel is because Jack, Kate, and Sayid were in close proximity with Sawyer, so they time traveled with Sawyer. Same thing with Hurley. When Jin goes back to the van, Hurley is in close proximity to Jin, so Hurley time travels with Jin. So it's basically just like the Zodiac time traveling, essentially. So once everybody time travels, there's no one there to hold the cord and help Juliet, so the cord snaps and Juliet falls. So it's basically Juliet falls in my version too, but it's just under completely different circumstances. And it's actually kind of tragic because like Juliet's completely alone when she falls too. She doesn't even have anybody to say I love you to. In 2007, Ray and Locke make their way back through the tunnel to the statue. And Ray says, "So, in the few seconds that we have left, what else can I do for you?" And Locke says, "Tell me, what is my purpose here on the island? What is it that I'm supposed to do?" And Ray says, "I'm surprised you don't know that for yourself, given that you passed all the tests." Now, Ray says this very sarcastically because Ray knows that the monster actually attacked Locke at the end of season 1. So earlier in this episode, when Locke says to Richard that he's passed all the tests, Locke actually lies to Richard. Locke didn't pass the smoke monster test. So back to what Ray was saying. Ray says, "But if you must know, the reason I crashed the plane was to get Christian back to the island. Everyone else was just by chance, even you." And Locke says, "No, what? No, I don't accept this. I'm a part of this. Jack and..." Ray cuts him off. "I answered your question, now let me be. You wanted the answer. I can't help if you don't like it. Take everybody to the temple and tell Dogen to prepare for a Cerberus attack." And then Locke is just, trying to figure everything out. So Locke's like, "Cerberus, you mean the monster?" Ray doesn't answer. He returns to his work. Locke gets into Ray's face. "Answer me!" And Locke grabs Ray, getting ready to punch him, but Ray is completely unfazed by this. He just stares blankly at Locke. Locke waits a few seconds and eventually lets go of Ray and turns and walks away. And he walks out of the room, just like Ben did before. And Ray finally answers, "And tell Dogen you're not the leader." Meanwhile, near the hatch, Jack wakes up in 2007 along with Sayid, Jin, and Hurley. And Sawyer immediately punches Jack, and Sayid has to hold him back. Sawyer yells, "You were wrong. We are back at the Swan Hatch, the same way it looked before we started traveling through time." And they all look around and realize they are back in 2007. And Jack's just like, "I don't understand why this plan didn't work. I don't understand why we just stopped time traveling too." He doesn't get it. So back in 1977, we see Juliet and the bomb, and they did not time travel because they are too far underground. And just like in the actual show, Juliet kicks the bomb 8 times and the screen goes white. And that is the end of season 5 of my version of Lost. Alright guys, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel once you leave the page. And in the next video, we're finally getting to season 6, okay? And just to give you a small preview, here's what we're going to be doing in season 6. In season 6, we're going to be answering the what if question. What if the flash sideways was not the afterlife? Okay? So I'm already telling you, the flash sideways will not be the afterlife. So the question is, what will it be? Tune in next month to find out. And again, thank you so much for watching this video. And as always, take care.